Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Snoozy Scientist, where we gently explore the mysteries of our world, one sleepy yawn at a time. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend a little piece of your evening, your morning, or perhaps somewhere peacefully in between, winding down with me. Tonight we're traveling to the very bottom of the world, to a place we all know as the coldest and most lifeless place on our planet, a vast expanse of white desert where temperatures plunge below minus 60 degrees Celsius, and the cold there can freeze your breath in seconds. But not long ago in the history of our planet, this land was something very different. Once, Antarctica was one of the warmest places on Earth. This continent was bursting with life, alive with crocodiles slipping silently through rivers and dinosaurs wandering beneath the polar sun. Beneath nearly 2 miles of ice, scientists have discovered fossilized roots, pollen, and spores, which are silent fingerprints of rainforests that once flourished here. And among its ancient shores lived creatures almost unimaginable today, marsupials, and even giant penguins as tall as a grown human patrolling the beaches. Then came a transformation so extreme it almost defies belief. Nowhere else on Earth has a continent experienced such a reversal of fortune, from green and abundant to white and empty. But how could this happen? How could the warmest forests collapse into the coldest wasteland? What forces had the power to flip an entire continent upside down, to transform abundance into desolation? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, could this happen again? Antarctica's story is not just about ice. It is a reminder that our planet can change more violently than we dare to imagine. Tonight, we'll drift slowly into Antarctica's forgotten past and discover how it became the strangest, most extreme continent on Earth. But before we begin, if you find comfort in these peaceful journeys through science stories, it would mean so much to me if you gave this video a gentle like and maybe tap subscribe. It helps more curious minds like you find their way to this peaceful little corner of the internet and lets the algorithm know that sleep and science go perfectly together. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments, where are you winding down from tonight and what time is it there? I love seeing how far across the world these soft explorations travel. Now take a deep breath, close your eyes, and together let's step softly into the impossible transformation of Antarctica from fire to ice. To understand how Antarctica could once have been a land of warmth and forests, we have to travel even further back in time, to an age when the world's continents looked nothing like they do today. If you could have gazed at a map of Earth hundreds of millions of years ago, you would not see the familiar outlines of Africa, South America, Asia, or Australia. Instead, you would see vast supercontinents, great land masses where many of today's continents were joined together. One of these was Gondwana, a colossal supercontinent that stretched across the southern half of the globe. Gondwana was immense, covering much of what we now know as South America, Africa, Arabia, India, Australia, and of course Antarctica. At its heart, Antarctica was not at the bottom of the world, locked in cold and isolation, but part of a sprawling green world connected to the warmth of the tropics. In fact, during this time, Antarctica lay closer to the equator, bathed in sunlight, and surrounded by seas that carried warmth across its shores. This position near the equator meant the climate was humid and in many regions tropical. Imagine broad, steaming jungles, alive with insects and strange amphibians, spreading across landscapes that today are buried under ice. The air would have been heavy with moisture, the kind of air that clings to your skin, carrying the smell of vegetation and the constant chorus of life. The rivers of Gondwana twisted through swampy forests, and vast plains were carpeted with greenery. Antarctica, at this point was indistinguishable from the lush rainforests of its Gondwana neighbors. Geological records whisper the truth of this lost world. Beneath Antarctica's current mountains of ice are layers of soil that tell of a warm, fertile past. Rocks hold the chemical signatures of once living plants, and the minerals locked within them bear the marks of tropical weathering. Ancient soils, known as paleosols, can still be traced in fragments beneath glaciers and in exposed outcrops on islands at the continent's edge. These ancient soils reveal that once, long ago, this was a land where roots pushed deep into the earth, where leaves fell in thick mats, and where decomposition enriched the soil with nutrients. The very structure of these fossil soils reveals that they developed in humid conditions, with abundant rainfall and temperatures far above freezing. When scientists study thin slices of these rocks under microscopes, they can see the microscopic imprints of plant matter that decayed millions of years ago. They find clays and iron oxides that only form in warm and wet environments, the kind of landscape that could never exist in the Antarctica we know today. These ancient records are like a faint echo of a tropical chorus locked away in the stone. What is especially remarkable is how long this warm chapter lasted. For tens of millions of years, Antarctica remained a green and living part of Gondwana. It did not sit in frozen isolation, but played its role in a vibrant ecosystem that stretched across half the planet. This was a time when Earth's climate was dominated by warmth, when high levels of carbon dioxide kept temperatures elevated, and when forests thrived in places that now seem unthinkable. The presence of tropical soils in Antarctica is not a minor footnote, but clear proof of a climate system that once allowed the poles themselves to be green. Even today, when scientists drill through the thick ice or explore the rocky edges of the continent, they encounter pieces of this story. Fossilized soils appear in layers that speak of rain-drenched ground, of roots that once spread wide, and of surface layers that were churned by animals and plants alike. Some soils even contain chemical traces of ancient microbes, tiny life forms that thrived in the warmth long before ice buried them. These records are not just scientific data, they are time capsules, preserving the memory of a world that could hardly be more different from the one we know. When you imagine Antarctica as part of Gondwana, it is easier to imagine how such a transformation was possible. What is now an isolated continent at the bottom of the world was once part of a family of lands connected to the tropics. Its position closer to the equator gave it abundant warmth. Its soils, now fossilized, tell of rain and fertility. Its rivers and valleys, now locked beneath ice, once supported forests that stretched to the horizon. From this foundation, Antarctica's story begins. Its roots lie in the tropical heart of Gondwana, where it was green and alive, indistinguishable from the other lands that shared its fate. Yet Gondwana itself was never stable. The very forces that brought these continents together would eventually tear them apart, and with that tearing, Antarctica's journey would change forever. And so, from these ancient tropical soils, we drift onward into the next chapter of this story, where the rainforests of Antarctica begin to emerge more vividly, preserved beneath the weight of ice and time. When scientists first drilled deep into the edge of Antarctica, they expected to find little more than frozen rock and compacted ice. What they uncovered instead was something extraordinary. From cores pulled up from hundreds of meters below the seafloor near the Amundsen Sea, they found the unmistakable traces of an ancient rainforest. Hidden beneath the ice for nearly 90 million years, there were preserved roots, grains of pollen, and spores so perfectly kept that they still told stories of the trees and plants that once flourished there. The soil was not the barren ground you would expect in a frozen desert, but a rich and fertile layer that had supported life in astonishing abundance. Tiny fragments of roots had pushed their way through that soil long before humans ever walked the earth. Pollen grains, each one smaller than a grain of sand, still carried the microscopic fingerprints of plants that had thrived in warm and wet conditions. Spores, once scattered by ferns into the air, lay preserved as if waiting to remind us of a time when the bottom of the world was green. These discoveries painted a vivid picture of what Antarctica looked like when it was warm. Dense forests once covered the land, forests so thick that little sunlight could reach the ground. The trees were not the same as those we see today, but ancient relatives of conifers, ferns, and cycads, towering plants that could survive in climates very different from our own. Their roots dug deep, their trunks grew tall, and their canopies stretched wide, creating a living roof above the forest floor. Perhaps the most astonishing thing about these ancient forests was their ability to endure the long months of darkness that came with Antarctica's position near the pole. Even in those warmer times, the tilt of the Earth meant that the continent still experienced long polar nights, when the sun would vanish for weeks or even months at a time. Yet these trees had adapted. Some likely slowed their growth, entering a kind of dormancy as the light disappeared. Others may have developed special ways to keep their leaves alive in the dim glow of twilight. When the sun finally returned, flooding the skies with light for the long polar summers, the forests would have erupted into life again, bursting with greenery and growth. The pollen and spores trapped in those cores revealed a staggering diversity of life that filled those forests. It was not a single type of tree, but a complex ecosystem with many different species coexisting together. Ferns spread across the forest floor, cycads and shrubs filled the gaps, and towering conifers formed the canopy above. Each plant played a role in the balance of the ecosystem, feeding insects, shading the ground, and recycling nutrients into the soil. Even without animal fossils in these particular cores, the evidence of such plant diversity suggests that the forests must have supported entire webs of life. Insects would have buzzed through the undergrowth, feeding on leaves and spreading pollen. Small reptiles and amphibians likely hunted in the shadows. The rivers that wound through the forests would have carried not just water, but also nutrients and life, supporting creatures far larger than insects or frogs. These forests were not isolated patches of green, they were vast connected ecosystems that stretched across much of the continent. When you hold a microscope up to one of those grains of pollen, you are staring directly into deep time. You are seeing a single particle that once drifted on a warm breeze through a forest that no longer exists. Each grain, each spore, is like a time capsule, frozen in ice, whispering of a lost world. To find them beneath 2 miles of frozen sheet is like discovering an ancient painting sealed in a vault, a message from a world that seems impossible compared to what we see today. What these rainforests tell us is not only that Antarctica was warm, but that it was alive with complexity. It was not simply green, it was structured, layered, and dynamic, a forest capable of adapting to months without sunlight and bursting into life when the long summer days arrived. The plants that once grew there were more than survivors. They were engineers of their environment, shaping soils, influencing rivers, and anchoring entire ecosystems. And as scientists pieced together this picture of a rainforest locked beneath the ice, another layer of the story came into focus. These forests did not exist in isolation. They were part of a living continent, one that supported not just plants, but animals of surprising size and variety. From here, the story begins to shift, from the trees and soils that sustained the land, to the creatures that roamed beneath the polar sun, leaving their own fossils and traces of life behind. The rainforests of ancient Antarctica were not empty, silent places. They pulsed with movement, with creatures that filled every layer of the ecosystem. Beneath the towering conifers and ferns, shadows shifted as animals roamed. Across the forest floor, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the undergrowth, footsteps that belonged not to mammals or modern predators, but to dinosaurs. The fossil record shows that several species of dinosaurs once made their way into Antarctica, not as permanent residents at first, but as seasonal visitors that followed migrations. Imagine herds of long-necked sauropods, their massive bodies rising like living towers above the canopy, moving slowly through the green wilderness. These giants, weighing many tons, would have eaten endlessly to sustain themselves, stripping leaves from branches and snapping smaller trees as they passed. Following them came predators, large theropods with curved claws and sharp teeth stalking through the dappled shadows of the polar forest. In the hush of the long polar twilight, their calls would have carried far through the trees, reminders that these forests were not only homes, but also hunting grounds. It is hard to imagine dinosaurs in a place we now see as frozen, yet the evidence lies in their bones. Fossilized remains discovered in the rocky outcrops of Antarctica tell us that both herbivores and carnivores once thrived here. These were not isolated stragglers, but entire populations, animals that had adapted to endure the long periods of low light that came with Antarctica's polar position. Even when the sun disappeared for weeks, these forests still offered food, shelter, and enough warmth for survival. The presence of dinosaurs confirms what the soils and pollen already suggested, that this was no barren land, but a thriving wet ecosystem. Alongside the dinosaurs, rivers and wetlands wound through the forests, and in those waters lived creatures more familiar to us today. Fossils reveal that crocodile ancestors once slid silently through Antarctic rivers, waiting with still patience for anything careless enough to approach the water's edge. Their scaled bodies cut through the dark water with practiced ease, while above them the dense canopy kept the rivers shaded and cool. These ancient crocodiles remind us that the ecosystems here were not only rich in plant life, but also supported large reptiles, predators perfectly suited to riverine environments. Turtles too swam in these waters, their shells protecting them as they grazed on aquatic plants or basked on muddy banks beneath the dim sun. They left behind fragments of shell and bone, reminders that these slow and steady animals had once thrived even in a land that would later become synonymous with cold. Alongside them, smaller creatures like marsupials scurried through the underbrush, their bones discovered in fossil beds on islands that fringe the modern Antarctic coastline. These marsupials would have lived in the shadows of the forest, feeding on insects, fruits, and small plants, quietly carving out a niche in this vast and vibrant ecosystem. The discovery of these animals was not expected. For decades, Antarctica was thought to be too hostile, even in the distant past, for such life to exist. But the fossil evidence proved otherwise. Entire skeletons, fragments of bone, and the impressions of once living bodies pressed into stone all reveal the truth of a land teeming with life. When these fossils are studied under the careful eyes of paleontologists, they tell of ecosystems rich in diversity, ecosystems that could only have survived in a climate that was warm, humid, and abundant with vegetation. The very fact that crocodiles and turtles could survive here confirms the presence of stable rivers and wetlands. These are animals that require not only warmth but consistent access to water. They cannot endure in harsh or barren lands. Their fossils are living proof that the rivers of Antarctica once flowed freely, carrying nutrients across the continent, feeding forests, and sustaining countless species. Combined with the remains of marsupials, these fossils paint an image of a landscape that was alive in every corner, from the towering dinosaurs above to the reptiles gliding silently below. Even the presence of giant penguins, some taller than the average human, has been confirmed in Antarctic fossil beds. These remarkable birds stood as sentinels of the ancient coasts, diving deep into rich seas and returning to the beaches that stretched far inland during warmer times. Unlike the small tuxedoed penguins we know today, these giants were powerful swimmers that filled a role similar to seals or sea lions. Their bones speak of a time when the oceans around Antarctica teemed with life just as much as its forests did. With every fossil uncovered, the story of this ancient continent grows clearer. Dinosaurs migrated beneath the polar canopy, crocodiles lurked in shaded rivers, turtles drifted lazily through wetlands, marsupials scurried in the shadows, and penguins as tall as people patrolled the coasts. Together, they confirm that Antarctica was once a warm, wet, and complex ecosystem, alive with species that could never survive in the frozen emptiness of today. As we leave behind the footprints of these creatures in the soil and stone, the story widens even further. To understand how such forests and animals could exist at the pole, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture of Earth's climate at the time, a world locked in a greenhouse state where heat and moisture ruled. The animals and forests of ancient Antarctica did not exist in isolation. They were part of a wider Earth, a planet caught in what scientists call a greenhouse world. To understand how crocodiles, dinosaurs, and rainforests could survive at the pole, we have to look at the atmosphere and oceans that shape the climate of the entire planet. During much of the mid-Cretaceous period, which reached its height about 90 million years ago, levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere were many times higher than what we breathe today. Some estimates suggest carbon dioxide concentrations were 4 to 6 times greater than modern levels. This blanket of greenhouse gases trapped heat across the globe, creating an environment where warmth spread evenly from the equator to the poles. The result was a world without permanent ice, not even at the highest latitudes. Imagine standing at the top of the planet and not seeing endless white fields of ice, but open oceans glistening under a pale sun. The polar seas were not frozen, but liquid and warm, their surface temperatures closer to those we might expect along modern tropical coasts. Without ice reflecting sunlight back into space, the dark waters absorbed even more energy, locking the warmth in place and amplifying the greenhouse effect. The oceans were critical in sustaining this global warmth. They moved heat like great conveyor belts, carrying it from the equator outward to the poles. Warm water currents washed against the edges of Antarctica, feeding its rivers and rains. These currents were stronger and more expansive than those of today because there were no polar ice caps to block or redirect their paths. As a result, Antarctica received a steady stream of heat and moisture, like a tropical gift delivered to its shores year after year. This flow of energy explains why forests could survive even during the long polar nights. The warmth stored in the oceans acted like a buffer, preventing the land from plunging into freezing darkness when the sun disappeared for weeks at a time. Even in the dim months, the climate remained mild enough to support roots, leaves, and entire ecosystems. The oceans were like silent guardians, holding back the cold and ensuring that life could continue. In such a greenhouse world, the boundaries between climates blurred. Tropical plants reached much farther north and south than they do today. Creatures we now associate with warm regions, like crocodiles and turtles, could be found close to the poles. Antarctica was not alone in this. Greenland, the Arctic, and Siberia also show evidence of forests, insects, and rich ecosystems during the same period. The whole Earth was wrapped in a blanket of heat, and the poles were simply extensions of the equatorial belt rather than frozen outposts. Geological records reveal just how profound this transformation was. Sediments pulled from the ancient ocean floor show chemical fingerprints of warm, nutrient rich seas. Fossils of marine plankton, tiny organisms that lived in vast numbers, prove that the oceans teemed with life. These plankton absorbed carbon dioxide during their lifetimes, and when they died, their remains drifted to the seafloor, preserving snapshots of ocean chemistry and temperature. The evidence shows that oceans near Antarctica were not icy, but closer to the temperatures of today's subtropical waters. The air, too, carried signs of this greenhouse state. The layers of soil and plant remains discovered beneath Antarctica's ice are packed with carbon signatures that can only form in humid, warm conditions. Together, the air and the oceans reinforced each other, building a climate system where the entire globe leaned toward heat. It was not just Antarctica that benefited, but the entire planet, a world where cold was rare and warmth ruled the rhythm of life. This greenhouse Earth also meant that sea levels were far higher than they are now. With no polar ice sheets to lock away water, the oceans spread across continental margins, flooding coastal plains and creating shallow seas that stretched far inland. In many regions, these shallow seas were cradles of biodiversity, filled with ammonites, giant marine reptiles, and swarms of fish. Around Antarctica, the warm waters would have supported a similarly rich array of life, from plankton at the surface to great marine reptiles that hunted in the depths. The lack of ice meant that the contrast between land and sea was softer than it is today. There were no glaciers grinding down mountains or calving into the ocean. Instead, rivers meandered gently across the land, feeding wetlands and swamps. Rain fell regularly, fueled by evaporation from the warm seas, and this cycle of water sustained the vast forests that spread across the continent. The greenhouse effect did not simply warm Antarctica, it stabilized it, keeping it wet and green for tens of millions of years. When we picture this world, it feels alien because it contradicts everything we know about the frozen Antarctica of today. Yet the evidence is overwhelming. High carbon dioxide levels, warm oceans, and an absence of permanent ice created a planet that allowed rainforests to grow at the pole. It was a time when life flourished in extremes that now feel impossible. And as this greenhouse Earth carried on, Antarctica began to take on a shape and character that would set the stage for its future. The supercontinent of Gondwana was shifting, slowly tearing apart. Australia and South America were drifting away, leaving Antarctica more isolated with each passing million years. The warmth remained for a time, but the seeds of change had already been planted, and soon Antarctica's story would take another dramatic turn. By the time we reached 35 to 40 million years ago, Antarctica had already begun to drift farther south, breaking away from the embrace of Gondwana. Yet even as it inched closer to the pole, it was still a land that could surprise us. In the early and middle parts of the Eocene epoch, Antarctica was not yet the icy desert we know today, but a continent that still thrived with warmth, its landscapes green and alive, resembling places far more familiar to us. If you picture the rolling forests and misty coasts of modern New Zealand, you come close to imagining the kind of world Antarctica once was. Evidence of this past is written into the rocks of Seymour Island, just off the Antarctic peninsula. This island is like a natural time capsule, its exposed cliffs and layered sediments holding fossils that reveal the kind of life that flourished during the Eocene. When paleontologists carefully chip away at its stone, they uncover the delicate imprints of leaves, the outlines of flowers, and the bones of creatures that tell us about a time when Antarctica was still a subtropical haven. Among the fossils are the remains of marsupials, small mammals that carried their young in pouches, much like opossums or kangaroos do today. These marsupials were not giants, but hardy survivors, feeding on plants and insects and scurrying through the underbrush of the Antarctic forests. Their presence is striking because it links Antarctica not just to South America, but also to Australia, suggesting that these continents were once connected by land routes that allowed animals to move freely across them. The marsupials of Seymour Island are reminders of a time when Antarctica was not isolated, but part of a wider network of life. The bird fossils found here add another layer to the story. Among them are the remains of tropical species, birds that thrived in lush, humid forests. Their bones are small and fragile, yet they survived long enough to be buried in the sediments and preserved through millions of years. Some may have resembled parrots or other forest dwellers that needed abundant trees and food to survive. To find such birds in Antarctica is another clear sign that the climate was warm and that forests covered much of the land. The plants tell perhaps the most vivid story of all. Fossilized leaves discovered on Seymour Island show the fine veins of broad-leaved trees, the kind that grow in wet, temperate forests. These leaves, along with the imprints of flowers and fruits, reveal an ecosystem rich in diversity. It was not a sparse or struggling landscape, but one filled with complex plant life that could support birds, mammals, and reptiles alike. Even pollen grains trapped in the sediments confirm this. Tiny particles that floated through the air millions of years ago and settled quietly into the soil, now serving as silent witnesses of a subtropical Antarctica. What made Antarctica of the Eocene look so much like modern New Zealand was not only the types of plants and animals, but also the overall feel of the environment. Imagine misty valleys filled with ferns, conifers, and broad-leaved trees. Coastal areas would have been fringed with forests that looked out over open seas, seas that remained ice-free and mild. Rainfall was common, carried by warm currents that still reach the continent. Temperatures were cool at times, but never freezing, and the rhythm of life followed the pattern of forests and rivers, rather than snow and ice. The marsupials scurried through dense vegetation, birds called from the canopy, and reptiles likely basked on the riverbanks. The air carried the scents of flowering plants and the sounds of insects buzzing in the undergrowth. This was not an Antarctica of silence, but one of noise and movement, alive with the same kinds of patterns we associate with subtropical forests today. The similarity to New Zealand is no accident, for both regions share ancient ties to Gondwana and still carry echoes of that shared past in their ecosystems. The story preserved in Seymour Island's rocks is one of continuity and change. The continuity is seen in the types of animals and plants that connect Antarctica to its Gondwanan neighbors, showing us how life once moved across vast connected landscapes. The change is in Antarctica's slow slide southward, a journey that would eventually separate it from those neighbors and place it firmly in the path of isolation and cold. At this stage, though, it was still green, still connected, still capable of sustaining marsupials, tropical birds, and flourishing forests. As scientists sift through these fossils, they see not only the bones and leaves of long-dead species, but also the reflection of a climate that was still gentle enough to allow such life to thrive. These discoveries provide a bridge between the rainforest world of the Cretaceous and the icy transformation that lay ahead. In the Eocene, Antarctica was balanced between two identities, holding onto its subtropical warmth even as the forces of tectonic movement and shifting currents began to reshape its destiny. From here, the story moves forward as small cracks began to appear in this warmth, cracks that hinted at the immense changes that were approaching when the long era of greenery would slowly give way to the first whispers of ice. For millions of years, Antarctica had thrived as a land of warmth and forests, its valleys alive with marsupials, its skies filled with tropical birds, and its coastlines free of ice. But the balance that had allowed this subtropical world to flourish was fragile, held in place by high levels of carbon dioxide and oceans that carried warmth to its shores. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, that balance began to shift. The air itself started to change. Carbon dioxide, the gas that had wrapped the Earth in a blanket of warmth during the greenhouse age, began to decline. The reasons were complex, tied to the deep workings of the planet. As mountains rose across different continents, newly exposed rock began to react with the atmosphere, pulling carbon dioxide out of the air through weathering. At the same time, the growth of lush vegetation in other parts of the world was locking carbon into soils and sediments. The oceans too played their part, drawing down more of the gas as currents shifted and new pathways of circulation opened. What had once been an atmosphere thick with heat-trapping gases was gradually becoming thinner, allowing more of the planet's warmth to leak away into space. At first, the signs were subtle. Temperatures dipped, not enough to kill the forests or drive away the animals, but just enough to change the rhythms of life. The long polar nights grew colder, the soil holding frost longer than it once had. Rivers carried chillier waters down from the highlands, and the lush undergrowth that had once thrived in constant humidity began to feel the edge of stress. These were not yet the great ice sheets that would one day swallow the continent, but they were the first whispers of what was to come. In isolated pockets, on the highest ridges, and in the shadowed valleys where the sunlight barely reached, thin layers of ice began to form. They clung to rock faces and gathered in hollows, small and fleeting at first, melting when the summer light returned, but leaving their mark. For the first time in tens of millions of years, Antarctica began to feel the touch of frost. The fossil record captures these hints of cooling in ways both delicate and undeniable. Chemical signatures in the soil show that temperatures were falling. Layers of sediment from surrounding seas contain the shells of plankton that thrived in cooler waters, their very structure reflecting the shift in climate. Even the growth rings of fossilized trees from this time reveal that the seasons were becoming sharper, with slower growth during the colder months and shorter bursts of expansion when warmth returned. For the animals that called Antarctica home, the change must have been gradual but deeply felt. Dinosaurs and crocodiles that had once moved freely through the forests began to retreat as habitats shifted. The marsupials and birds that had filled Seymour Island's forests still clung on, but they lived in a land that was beginning to change around them. Wetlands shrank as frosts lingered, and rivers carried icy meltwater into the sea. Each winter night stretched longer and colder, and the summers, though still bright and abundant, had lost some of their former strength. To imagine this moment is to picture a continent caught between two worlds. On one hand, it still carried the memory of the subtropical paradise that had endured for tens of millions of years. On the other, it was beginning to show the first scars of a colder, harsher future. The forests were still there, green and alive, but frost crept into the soil. At their roots, the rivers still flowed, but thin ice began to crust their edges. The air was still breathable and rich with life, but the balance of gases that had sustained the warmth was slipping away. These cracks in the warmth did not yet spell the end, but they were the beginning of a long and inevitable transformation. Antarctica was on the cusp of a change that would not only reshape its forests and rivers, but also alter the climate of the entire planet. And as these early frosts gathered in the shadows, the continent itself continued to drift farther south setting the stage for even greater changes. The land was moving, the oceans were shifting, and the winds were beginning to flow in new patterns. Soon, Antarctica's isolation would become complete, and the cooling that had begun quietly would accelerate into something far more profound. As the air cooled and the first hints of frost appeared on the edges of rivers and valleys, the land beneath those forests was moving as well. Continents are never still. They drift slowly, carried on the restless currents of the Earth's mantle, shifting in ways that are invisible in a human lifetime, but immense across millions of years. Antarctica was no exception. Once it had been nestled securely within Gondwana, sharing warmth and life with South America, Australia, Africa, and India. Now it was beginning a journey of separation, one that would take it southward into colder latitudes and change its destiny forever. The process unfolded over tens of millions of years. At first, the movement was so slow that the forests and rivers hardly seemed to notice. But as Antarctica crept farther toward the pole, the days of sunlight grew longer in summer, and the nights of darkness grew longer in winter. The tilt of the Earth ensured that life here was already unusual, but drifting farther south magnified those extremes. Each year, the sunlight climbed a little lower in the sky, and each winter, the cold lingered a little longer. Meanwhile, the great supercontinent was breaking apart piece by piece. South America began to pull away, drifting westward and northward into its modern position. This separation tore open new waterways and changed the circulation of the seas. The coastlines of Antarctica, once sheltered by connected land, became more exposed to the vast open ocean. Australia, too, began its slow escape, breaking free and drifting northward, carrying with it marsupials and plant species that had once flourished across a shared landscape. As these lands peeled away, Antarctica stood increasingly alone at the bottom of the world. The geography of the planet was being rewritten. Where there had once been wide land bridges linking continents together, there were now stretching seas. As South America and Antarctica moved apart, a gap began to open that would eventually become the Drake Passage. This narrow seaway, though not yet fully formed, hinted at the changes to come. Similarly, the widening waters between Antarctica and Australia cut the continent off from the flow of warm currents that had long carried life-sustaining heat from the tropics. Each separation was like the closing of a door, one by one, shutting Antarctica away from the warmth it had once known. For the forests and animals that still clung to the land, the changes were profound. Migrating dinosaurs that had once crossed through shared Gondwanan landscapes now found barriers of sea in their way. Marsupials that had moved freely between Australia and Antarctica could no longer cross, their populations becoming isolated and more fragile. Birds that had once flown across wide ranges now faced longer journeys over open water. Even the plants felt the difference. Seeds and spores that had once been carried by wind or drifting animals across connected continents now found themselves cut off, unable to spread beyond the boundaries of a land that was drifting into solitude. Geological evidence confirms this slow unraveling. The shifting of tectonic plates left scars in the rock, rifts where continents once touched, and volcanic activity along the seams of separation. Layers of marine sediments show when new seas flooded in, replacing land with water. Fossils, too, reflect the changes, with species disappearing from Antarctic records as they became trapped on other continents, and new forms arriving only briefly before the growing distance made migration impossible. As Antarctica drifted southward, its fate became more tightly bound to its latitude. The farther it moved, the colder its winters became. The warmth of the greenhouse world still lingered, keeping the forests alive for a time, but the stage was being set for something different. The continents that had once protected it with shared warmth were now pulling away, leaving Antarctica increasingly vulnerable to the encircling ocean and the relentless cold of the pole. The story of Antarctica is, in many ways, the story of isolation. The gradual movement of South America and Australia away from its sides did not just rearrange the map, it cut off the pathways of warmth and life that had once sustained the land. This slow drifting would eventually allow an ocean current to wrap around the continent without obstruction, a current that would trap cold water around its shores and seal its frozen fate. But for now, in this stage of its journey, Antarctica was still green, still alive, but already beginning to lose the connections that had tied it to the rest of the world. And so, with the continent set adrift and the oceans reshaping themselves around its edges, the conditions were forming for the next great change. As the gaps of water widened and new passages opened, Antarctica was preparing to cross the threshold from a land of fading forests to a realm where ice would take command. As Antarctica drifted farther south and its ties to other continents weakened, the separation between it and South America began to widen. What was once a land bridge of shared valleys and forests broke apart, and the ocean slowly pushed its way into the gap. Over millions of years, that gap became deeper and broader until it formed one of the most important waterways in Earth's history, the Drake Passage. The Drake Passage, which today lies between the southern tip of South America and the Antarctic Peninsula, is not just another stretch of sea. It is the narrowest connection between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, yet it plays an enormous role in the way our planet's climate works. Before it opened, warm equatorial waters could still flow southward and lap at the edges of Antarctica, keeping its coasts and forests alive. But once the Drake Passage fully formed, the entire system of ocean circulation began to change. The opening of this waterway allowed something new to emerge, something that would transform the fate of Antarctica. With no land to block it, a powerful ocean current began to circle the continent, sweeping around it in a vast loop. This current is known as the Antarctic circumpolar current, and it is the strongest current on Earth. Even today, it moves more water than any other ocean flow, a conveyor belt of cold that races endlessly around Antarctica. The birth of this current was the turning point. Before it existed, Antarctica was part of a larger global system of warmth, connected to tropical waters that carried heat from the equator to the poles. But once the Antarctic circumpolar current began to spin, it acted like a barrier, trapping cold water around the continent and cutting it off from the warmer seas to the north. It was as if Antarctica had been wrapped in a ring of isolation, sealed away from the rest of the world by a curtain of frigid water. For the forests and animals still clinging to the land, this change would have been devastating. The steady warmth that had allowed trees to survive the polar winters was no longer reaching them. Moisture still fell as rain, but the temperatures began to dip lower each year, and the polar nights grew more punishing. Slowly, the lush green forests that had stretched across the continent began to thin. Plants that needed stable warmth could no longer endure, and animals that depended on them for food and shelter struggled to survive. The geological evidence of this shift is clear. Sediment cores taken from the ocean floor show abrupt changes in the chemistry of the seas. Warmer-loving plankton species disappear from the record, replaced by organisms adapted to colder waters. The pollen grains that once told of abundant forests give way to fewer and fewer traces of plant life. Even the oxygen isotopes preserved in ancient shells reveal that the oceans were cooling quickly as the Antarctic circumpolar current strengthened its grip. The current itself became a powerful engine of climate, not only for Antarctica, but for the entire planet. By locking cold water around the continent, it intensified the global cooling that had already begun. The northward spread of cold water altered weather patterns thousands of kilometers away, helping to trigger the growth of ice sheets in the northern hemisphere as well. Antarctica was no longer just drifting into isolation, it was becoming the driver of a new and colder world. To imagine this moment is to picture the seas around Antarctica transformed from lifelines into walls. Where once warm currents had flowed like open doors, carrying heat and life, now there was only a rushing, circular stream of cold. The forests that had survived for so long were now besieged from every side. The rivers ran colder, and the coasts grew harsh. Step by step, season by season, Antarctica was being pulled deeper into the realm of ice. The story of this isolation was not only written in the oceans. Winds, too, began to change, following the pattern of the current encircling Antarctica in a tightening belt. These winds drove the surface waters even faster, reinforcing the separation between north and south. The atmosphere itself responded, growing colder as the continent became more cut off. Life that had endured through so many millions of years of warmth was now facing a new reality, one shaped by currents, winds, and the steady march of ice. And so, with the opening of the Drake Passage and the birth of the Antarctic circumpolar current, the transformation of Antarctica accelerated. The warmth was cut off, the forests faltered, and the first true isolation of the continent began. What followed would be the spread of permanent ice, a frozen empire that would come to dominate not only Antarctica itself, but also the climate of the entire Earth. With the opening of the Drake Passage and the swirling wall of the Antarctic circumpolar current locking the continent into isolation, the final piece of Antarctica's transformation began to take shape. The steady decline in carbon dioxide, combined with its new geography, created conditions that could no longer hold back the cold. At first, the changes appeared in patches, frost clinging longer to the soil and rivers freezing along their edges. But slowly, over millions of years, something new began to settle over the land. Permanent ice, thick and unyielding, started to form. The first of these ice sheets took hold in East Antarctica, the highest and coldest part of the continent. Here, the land rose in vast plateaus and mountains, reaching heights that made the air thinner and colder than the low-lying coastal regions. Snow that once melted during warmer months began to linger, layer upon layer, piling up until its weight compacted into solid ice. Each winter added more, and each summer failed to take it away. What had once been seasonal frost became something lasting, something that no returning sunlight could erase. As the ice expanded, it spread across valleys and ridges, covering the ground in a silent, creeping white. The forests that had held on through so many ages were buried beneath the advancing sheets. Their roots, their leaves, and their trunks disappeared under the pressure, leaving only faint impressions in the soils that lay trapped beneath. Animals that had roamed those landscapes were forced to retreat or perish, unable to survive as their habitats vanished. Antarctica, which had once been bursting with warmth and green life, was being transformed into something entirely new, a land claimed by ice. The oceans recorded this change in their own way. Sediment cores pulled from deep beneath the seafloor reveal abrupt drops in global sea levels during this time. When the first massive ice sheets formed in East Antarctica, they locked away enormous volumes of water, lowering the seas by tens of meters. Shallow coastal plains around the world became exposed, reshaping coastlines thousands of kilometers from Antarctica itself. Ancient shorelines, once washed by waves, became dry land as the planet adjusted to this new reservoir of frozen water. The signal of these sea level drops is sharp, unmistakable in the geological record, a marker of the moment Earth entered a new chapter. For the climate, the birth of these ice sheets was a tipping point. Their bright, reflective surfaces bounced sunlight back into space, amplifying the cooling that had already begun. The more the ice grew, the colder the continent became, and the colder it grew, the more the ice spread. This feedback loop pushed Antarctica deeper into the frozen state that defines it today. What began in East Antarctica spread slowly outward, reaching into the western mountains and creeping down toward the coasts. The frozen era had begun, and it was not a temporary phase, but a permanent transformation. To imagine this shift is to picture a world in transition. On the one hand, the oceans were still warm in many places, the tropics still filled with lush forests and life. On the other, Antarctica was sealing itself into ice, its green past disappearing beneath glaciers that would never release their grip. From orbit, if you could have looked down at the Earth in this time, you would have seen the first great white crown forming at the bottom of the world, a new presence that would influence the entire planet. And yet, even as the ice sheet spread, the process was not uniform. Some areas still resisted, valleys where remnants of forest clung on, coasts where milder waters softened the blow. But the trend was unstoppable. The frozen grip tightened year by year, millennium by millennium, until the forests were gone and the rivers themselves lay beneath ice. Antarctica had crossed a threshold, and with it, Earth itself had entered a new regime. This was the true beginning of the frozen era, an age when the planet would cycle between warmer and colder phases, but never again return to the complete greenhouse world that had once allowed crocodiles and marsupials to thrive at the pole. Antarctica had become the anchor of Earth's ice, the keeper of seas, and the guardian of global climate. And with the first great ice sheets now in place, the story of transformation pressed forward toward a time when the forests and animals that had once flourished here would vanish entirely, leaving only silence and the spreading dominion of ice. As the first great ice sheets spread their reach across East Antarctica, the forests that had endured for millions of years began to falter. For countless generations, they had adapted to shifting climates, surviving long polar nights and thriving during the endless summers of light. But this time, the changes were too great. The cold no longer came as a brief visitor that melted away with the return of warmth. Now it lingered, season after season, until the very roots of the trees could no longer hold their ground. The once dense forests that had carpeted valleys and rolled across the hillsides began to thin. Tropical trees, with their broad leaves and need for steady warmth, were the first to go. Frost crept deeper into the soil each year, biting into roots that had once tapped into rich, moist earth. Leaves withered, branches cracked under the weight of unexpected snows, and the green canopy that had defined Antarctica for tens of millions of years slowly collapsed into silence. In the fossil record, this shift is captured with startling clarity. For ages, sediments had been rich with the pollen of countless plants, each grain a marker of the diversity that had once thrived here. Then, suddenly, those pollen grains became scarce. Layers that had once told of flourishing rainforests now revealed only fragments, faint traces of plants struggling to hang on. The abruptness of the change is one of the most striking aspects of Antarctica's story. It was not a slow fading away, but a steep, undeniable drop, an ecological cliff where warm-adapted species vanished almost at once. With the trees disappearing, the animals that had relied on them for food and shelter were left exposed. Reptiles that had once basked on riverbanks and hunted in wetlands began to vanish from the land. crocodile ancestors that had glided through ancient waters no longer had the warmth they needed to survive the long winters. Turtles, which had once thrived in the slow-moving rivers, became scarce as those rivers froze or dried beneath advancing glaciers. Even the marsupials, small and adaptable as they were, could not withstand the collapse of the forests that had sheltered them. Their bones, once scattered through subtropical soils, became rare and then disappeared altogether from the Antarctic record. Larger animals fared no better. Dinosaurs, which had roamed the polar forests during earlier epochs, had already been lost to extinction by this time, but the large mammals that followed in their wake faced the same harsh fate. As the forests collapsed, there was no longer enough food to support sizable herbivores, and with them gone, the predators that depended on them also disappeared. The great web of life that had spanned trees, rivers, and coastlines unraveled strand by strand until little remained. For scientists, the moment is visible in layers of rock and sediment. Fossil-rich deposits that had brimmed with variety abruptly give way to barren layers with few signs of life. Whole groups of species, from reptiles to mammals to forest trees, end their record here, as if the earth had turned a page and moved into a new chapter where their presence was no longer possible. The silence of extinction is written into the rocks, more powerful in its absence than in its abundance. To imagine Antarctica at this time is to picture a landscape in mourning. Valleys once filled with ferns and towering trees stood bare. Rivers that had once echoed with the splash of reptiles grew quiet under sheets of ice. Birds that had once flitted through the canopy lost their nesting grounds, and the calls that had once filled the forests fell silent. Even the soil itself changed, turning from rich, living ground into frozen layers locked beneath permafrost. The loss of forests also had effects that reached beyond Antarctica itself. Forests are not just homes for life, they are engines of climate, releasing and absorbing gases that shape the atmosphere. With their collapse, Antarctica stopped acting as a contributor to global greenery and instead became a cold reflector of sunlight, accelerating the cooling already underway. The feedback loops of ice and loss fed one another, driving the continent deeper into its frozen fate. And yet, even in this harsh moment, traces of life endured. Microbes buried beneath the soil may have survived in pockets, waiting in darkness. Tiny seeds, carried by the last birds or scattered by the wind, were buried under advancing snows, preserved as relics of a forested past. The fossil record does not show a complete silence, but it does show a sharp and dramatic change. Warm-adapted species that had flourished for ages met their abrupt end, leaving only the hardiest survivors to cling to existence in a land that was no longer green but increasingly white. The collapse of forest life was not the end of Antarctica's transformation, but only the next step in its descent into ice. As the trees and animals faded, the glaciers spread wider, advancing down valleys and across coastlines, sculpting the land into new forms and pushing Antarctica further into isolation. With the forests gone and the last warm-adapted animals vanishing from the record, Antarctica stood bare, exposed to the growing power of cold. What began as patches of frost and the first great ice sheets now deepened into a full transformation. Ice was no longer a seasonal visitor or an occasional intruder in shaded valleys. It was becoming the master of the land, advancing with a force that reshaped mountains, rivers, and coastlines. One of the most defining features of this new Antarctica was the rise of katabatic winds. These are winds born from ice itself, created when dense, frigid air collects over the high plateaus and then plunges down the slopes with unstoppable speed. As the ice sheets thickened across East Antarctica and spread westward, the air above them grew heavier and colder. Gravity pulled that air down the slopes, turning it into fierce, dry winds that screamed across the continent. Unlike the humid breezes that had once carried rainfall to the forests, these katabatic winds stripped moisture from the air, leaving Antarctica not only frozen but also arid, a desert of ice rather than sand. The power of these winds cannot be overstated. Even today, they can roar at speeds greater than 200 kilometers an hour, strong enough to scour the land and strip snow from the surface, piling it into ridges and dunes of frozen powder. In the ancient past, as the ice first took command, these winds became a constant presence, carrying cold air outward from the continent and helping to seal its fate as the coldest place on Earth. The combination of ice and wind created an environment where life had little chance to recover. Meanwhile, the glaciers advanced, fed by endless layers of snow compacting into solid ice. They pushed forward with a slow but relentless momentum. Glaciers are rivers of ice, and in Antarctica they began to carve deep valleys, grinding rock beneath their weight and reshaping entire mountain ranges. Where rivers had once meandered gently through forests, glaciers now gouged channels of bare stone. Where coastal plains had once been dotted with wetlands, thick walls of ice bulldozed their way toward the sea. The advancing ice did more than cover the land, it transformed it. Mountains that had once been softened by vegetation were scraped raw, their jagged peaks exposed. Valleys that had once been green with trees and ferns were deepened and widened into troughs. Even the coasts were altered, as glaciers met the ocean and sent icebergs adrift into surrounding seas. Antarctica was not simply changing its climate, it was reshaping its very skin under the pressure of ice. The silence that spread with this transformation was profound. The sounds of birds, insects, and flowing rivers faded. In their place came the groan of moving glaciers, the whistle of katabatic winds, and the distant thunder of ice cracking into the sea. The land had entered a new identity, one that was colder, harsher, and more absolute than any place else on Earth. Scientists studying the evidence of this time see it clearly in the rocks and sediments. Striations carved into stone tell of glaciers dragging their frozen weight across the land. Layers of marine deposits show the influx of cold meltwater pouring into the seas. Tiny fossils of plankton reveal dramatic cooling in surrounding oceans, their shells capturing the fingerprints of a new icy world. Everything points to the same conclusion: Antarctica had crossed into its frozen age. The most remarkable part of this shift is that it created not just a land of ice, but a desert. Though it seems paradoxical, Antarctica today is one of the driest places on Earth, and this identity began as the katabatic winds and expanding glaciers took control. With so much of its water locked in frozen form, very little was left to fall as rain. Snow did fall, but only in small amounts, and much of it was swept away by the winds before it could accumulate. The result was a continent both drowned in ice and starved of water, a frozen desert where moisture was scarce and cold reigned supreme. And as the glaciers spread across mountains and valleys, carrying the continent deeper into its icy fate, the story of Antarctica moved toward its next chapter. The land was no longer just drifting into isolation or cooling at the edges. It had been remade, claimed fully by the power of ice, with the winds and glaciers working together to sculpt it into the frozen desert we recognize today. As the glaciers grew thicker and stronger, they did not simply rest on the land. They began to move, slow but unrelenting, dragging their enormous weight across mountains and valleys. Ice is not still. It flows like a river, though its pace is so gradual that it cannot be seen in a human lifetime. Over thousands upon thousands of years, these rivers of ice carved into the rock beneath them, reshaping Antarctica with a force unlike anything else on Earth. Where valleys once wound gently through green forests, glaciers deepened them into great troughs. They pressed into cracks, widening them, pulling stones loose, and grinding them into dust. Mountains that had once been softened by soil and vegetation were scraped bare, their slopes scoured until they shone with raw rock. With every movement, the glaciers carried boulders and gravel within their frozen bodies, turning themselves into massive natural sandpaper. As they advanced, they cut into the land, leaving behind scars that are still visible today. One of the most striking features formed during this time were fjords. These long, steep-sided valleys were carved as glaciers pushed toward the sea. When the ice retreated, water filled the deep cuts, leaving behind narrow inlets that now define many of Antarctica's coasts. Imagine standing at the edge of one of these fjords in the ancient past, watching as a wall of ice moved silently forward, pressing down with unimaginable weight, and then retreating again to reveal a landscape transformed. Each fjord is a reminder of the colossal power glaciers had in shaping the continent. The grinding movement of the ice also left behind ridges, long sculpted lines that run across the land. These ridges were built as glaciers piled up rock and debris along their edges and at their fronts, marking the furthest points they reached before pulling back. Today, these moraines, as scientists call them, are like frozen signatures, tracing the advance and retreat of ice through deep time. By studying them, we can follow the paths glaciers once took, reading their movements across the face of the continent. Even the surfaces of Antarctica's exposed rocks carry the marks of this icy reshaping. Striations, long scratches cut into stone, reveal the direction of colossal ice flows. Each groove tells the story of a glacier dragging stones and debris across solid rock, leaving behind evidence of its passage. When scientists examine these striations, they can see how the ice once moved in powerful waves, spreading outward from the heart of the continent. Some scratches are shallow, others deep, but together they form a record of a landscape transformed by pressure and persistence. The scale of this carving was immense. Glaciers spread across entire mountain ranges, grinding them down and reshaping their peaks into jagged spires and rounded domes. Valleys became deeper, cliffs grew steeper, and coastlines were torn into pieces. Antarctica's modern outline, the one we see today on maps and from space, was born from this grinding of ice against stone. Every ridge, every fjord, and every basin owes its existence to the glaciers that advanced and retreated over millions of years. To imagine this process is to picture time itself flowing like ice. Year by year, snow accumulated and compacted, feeding the glaciers. With each new layer, the ice grew heavier, pushing harder against the land. Over centuries, the weight was enough to bend stone, to crush mountainsides, and to dig valleys deeper than rivers ever could. Over millennia, entire ranges were reshaped, their forms dictated by the steady hand of ice. Even today, Antarctica's landscape tells the story of this transformation. Beneath its ice sheets lie hidden valleys deeper than the Grand Canyon, carved not by water, but by glaciers that cut their way across the continent. Mountains like the Transantarctic Range stand as remnants of older forms, sculpted into new shapes by relentless grinding. The continent we see now, covered in white and edged with cliffs of ice, is the product of this long and violent process. The silence of modern Antarctica hides the echoes of that past. The howling katabatic winds sweep across fjords carved by ice and glaciers continue their slow crawl, still sculpting the land beneath them. Every ridge and striation is a reminder that the continent we know today was born not in a single moment, but through millions of years of pressure and motion, and as the land was being reshaped, another story was unfolding beneath the ice. Buried in the layers of rock and sediment, preserved beneath moraines and within fjords, lay the remains of the ecosystems that had once thrived here. Leaves, flowers, and bones were sealed away in hidden vaults, waiting for the day when human hands would discover them and piece together the memory of a green Antarctica now lost to time. As the glaciers carved Antarctica into its modern shape, grinding mountains into ridges and valleys into deep fjords, they also became keepers of memory. Beneath the weight of the ice, fragments of the world that had existed before were sealed away, hidden in stone and sediment. The continent, though silenced by cold, had not lost its story. It had buried it, and in places where the ice is thinner or where rock is pushed upward and left exposed, that story still waits to be read. One of the most remarkable windows into this lost world lies on Seymour Island, off the tip of the Antarctic peninsula. To the eye, Seymour is a barren place, a sweep of gray and brown rock, windswept and cold. Yet within its cliffs lies a fossil record unlike any other on Earth. Here, time has been layered, pressed, and preserved, capturing not just bones, but entire fragments of vanished ecosystems. Paleontologists who work on Seymour Island often describe it as walking through a library of the past. Each layer of sediment is a page, and within those pages are the preserved remains of life that thrived when Antarctica was still warm. Among the most delicate of these fossils are leaves. Their veins, still etched clearly into stone, tell of trees that once shaded the land. Some leaves are broad, the kind that would have belonged to plants adapted to humid, temperate forests. Others are narrower, pointing to conifers and shrubs that formed the structure of the ancient canopy. To hold one of these fossilized leaves is to touch the imprint of a forest that disappeared tens of millions of years ago, yet still lingers in stone. Flowers, too, have been discovered here, their fragile outlines preserved in sediment. The details may be faint, but they are enough to remind us that Antarctica was once a place of color and bloom. Fossilized petals and seeds whisper of meadows and forest edges where pollinators would have moved from plant to plant. In a continent that today knows only snow and rock, the idea of flowers once nodding in the breeze feels almost impossible, and yet the evidence is undeniable. Alongside the plants, animal fossils bring the ecosystems of ancient Antarctica into sharper focus. Bones of marsupials reveal that small mammals once scurried through the underbrush, carrying their young in pouches as they searched for food. Bird fossils show that flocks once filled the skies, including species that suggest links to tropical regions far to the north. Some of the most extraordinary finds are those of giant penguins, taller than a human, their bones discovered within the rocks of Seymour Island. These colossal birds stood guard on the ancient coasts, hunting in the rich seas that lapped at Antarctica's shores during the Eocene. The diversity preserved here is unlike anything seen elsewhere. Nowhere else on Earth has a fossil record captured such a blend of subtropical forests, marsupial mammals, giant seabirds, and reptiles, all coexisting at the edge of the pole. Seymour Island shows us not just that Antarctica was once warm, but that it was home to ecosystems unlike any other, combinations of life that vanished completely when the ice began to spread. The fossils tell of a world that is both familiar and alien, forests like those of New Zealand or South America, yet inhabited by species that no longer walk the earth. Even the smallest details are preserved, Tiny fish bones lie scattered in layers that were once riverbeds. Shells of mollusks and impressions of marine invertebrates mark where shallow seas met the land. Microscopic grains of pollen cling to the rock, each one a survivor of a world that has been gone for more than 30 million years. Together, they form a picture of an Antarctica that was not barren or lifeless, but abundant and alive in ways we struggle to imagine when staring at the icy expanse today. To walk across Seymour Island now, with cold winds tearing at the skin and icebergs floating in the distance, is to stand at the edge of two worlds. One is the frozen continent of today, silent and white. The other is the lost land preserved in stone, a place of forests, rivers, and animals that would seem out of place in modern Antarctica. Every fossil pulled from its cliffs is a reminder that the land beneath the ice carries memories of vanished life, sealed away in hidden vaults that glaciers could not erase. And as scientists carefully study these fossils, they uncover not just the story of individual species, but the story of entire ecosystems, ecosystems that flourished in conditions we no longer see anywhere on Earth. From leaves and flowers to animal bones and seashells, Seymour Island holds the proof that Antarctica was once one of the most extraordinary places on the planet. From these hidden vaults of life, the story deepens even further as the fossils of plants and animals give way to something even smaller, microscopic clues that capture the exact pace of change. In the grains of pollen and spores preserved in these layers lies the precise timeline of how a continent turned from green to white, while the bones of animals and the outlines of leaves speak clearly of a vanished world. Some of the most powerful evidence of Antarctica's transformation comes from things so small they are invisible to the naked eye. Hidden in the layers of rock and sediment, smaller than a grain of sand, lie the microfossils of pollen and spores. These tiny remnants, carried once by wind and water, are time capsules that survive the crushing weight of ice and stone. When placed under the lens of a microscope, they open a window into the past with remarkable precision, telling the story of climate and life, not in broad strokes, but year by year. Each pollen grain is a fingerprint, unique to the plant that produced it. The outer walls of pollen are made of a substance so tough it can last for tens of millions of years. Spores, released by ancient ferns and mosses, are just as resilient, their tiny shells locking in details of the ecosystems that created them. Trapped in sediments and frozen soils, these grains are like messages written in code, waiting for scientists to decipher them. When they are carefully extracted and studied, they reveal what kinds of plants once grew on Antarctica and, more importantly, how those plants changed as the climate shifted. In warm periods, the sediments are rich with a wide variety of pollen. Grains from flowering plants, conifers, and shrubs mingle together, showing that forests stretched widely across the land. Each type of pollen has a distinctive shape, from spheres to tiny spiked forms, and the sheer variety points to a vibrant and diverse ecosystem. During cooler intervals, however, that diversity narrows. The number of species represented falls, and certain plants disappear altogether from the record. The decline can be traced layer by layer, showing the gradual stress placed on ecosystems as the air cooled and the seasons grew harsher. But sometimes, the record does not only show gradual decline, it reveals moments of sudden and violent change. In certain layers, the pollen record shifts dramatically, with entire groups of plants vanishing between one layer and the next. It is as if the page of history had been turned abruptly, leaving no trace of what came before. These sharp breaks tell of rapid cooling events, when the balance of carbon dioxide and ocean currents tipped so quickly that forests could no longer adapt. Within the span of only a few centuries, or perhaps even less, entire ecosystems collapsed, and the fossil record preserves that silence with chilling clarity. Microfossils are not limited to pollen and spores. In the surrounding seas, plankton also left their shells behind, made of tiny crystals of calcium carbonate. These shells, smaller than the head of a pin, capture the chemistry of the seawater in which they formed. By studying the ratios of oxygen within these shells, scientists can reconstruct the temperatures of ancient oceans with extraordinary detail. Together with the pollen, they provide a double record: the story of life on land and the story of the seas that lapped against Antarctica's shores. The precision of these microfossils is astonishing. Unlike the broad impressions of leaves or the scattered bones of animals, they provide continuous records, each layer of sediment holding a nearly unbroken chain of information. When cores are drilled from the ocean floor near Antarctica, they bring up cylinders of mud that stretch back millions of years. Within those cylinders, countless pollen grains, spores, and plankton shells form a diary of climate. 1 centimeter of core might represent thousands of years, and within it, scientists can trace the rise and fall of forests, the cooling of seas, and the sudden onset of glaciation. The story told by these microfossils is not one of gentle fading but of volatility. It shows that Antarctica's transformation was punctuated by abrupt tipping points when conditions crossed thresholds and life could no longer hold on. A once thriving forest might vanish within the space of a geological instant, replaced by the dominance of cold-tolerant species, and then by silence. The pollen record shows not only the direction of change, but also its pace, reminding us that Earth's climate can shift with startling speed. To hold a slide of ancient pollen under a microscope is to look into the most fragile remnants of a lost world. Each grain, each spore, once drifted through the air of a forest that no longer exists, settling into soil or water and waiting millions of years to be found again. They are silent witnesses, carrying proof that Antarctica's descent into ice was not always slow, but often sudden, violent, and merciless. And as these microscopic secrets emerged from stone and sediment, they led scientists deeper into the search for evidence. Beyond pollen and spores, even the mud itself holds stories, its layers recording rainfall, vegetation loss, and the dates when forests finally collapsed. The next clues come not only from what we can see under the microscope, but from the chemical signatures hidden within the very sediments that still lie buried beneath Antarctica's frozen skin. If microfossils are the fine handwriting of Earth's past, then the sediments that hold them are the pages on which those words are written. Layer upon layer of mud, pressed and preserved over millions of years, became the archive of Antarctica's transformation. Each layer is a memory of the conditions that once reigned, a quiet witness to the rains that fell, the forests that grew, and the moment they were lost. When scientists drill deep into the seafloor around Antarctica or into exposed rock on its islands, they bring up long cylinders of sediment cores. These cores look plain at first glance, little more than columns of brown and gray mud, but under close study, they reveal a story of staggering detail. The thickness of the layers, their color, their chemistry, all combine to tell how Antarctica's climate changed, step by step. One of the clearest signals preserved in these sediments is the shift in rainfall. During the warm greenhouse times, the layers are rich and dark, filled with organic matter washed in from rivers and forests. They show that heavy rains once fell across the continent, feeding wetlands, nourishing soils, and carrying nutrients into the seas. The mud of these layers is dense with life, speckled with fragments of plants, and packed with signs of fertility. As the cooling began, those dark, fertile layers give way to lighter, thinner deposits. The rains became less frequent, and the rivers carried less material to the sea. Sediments from this period show a decline in organic matter, reflecting the weakening pulse of Antarctica's ecosystems. It is as if the land itself were breathing more shallowly, unable to sustain the heavy rains and lush greenery of its earlier years. In some layers, mud even changes in texture, showing where floods once rushed through valleys during storms, replaced later by drier, thinner washes of silt. These changes, frozen in stone, are evidence of a climate shifting toward aridity. But the sediments do not only show changes in rainfall, they also hold the chemical fingerprints of vegetation loss. When forests thrive, they release and recycle elements like carbon and nitrogen, which wash into rivers and leave traces in the mud. When those forests collapse, the chemistry of the sediments changes abruptly. Scientists, studying these cores, find sharp drops in the markers of plant life. Carbon isotopes decline, nitrogen patterns shift, and traces of organic compounds vanish almost overnight in geological terms. These signatures are not vague hints, they are exact chemical alarms pointing directly to the collapse of vegetation that once blanketed the land. In some layers, the transition is so sudden that it reads like catastrophe. One level of mud will be rich in plant remains, brimming with the signatures of a thriving forest, and the next will be barren, stripped of organic content. This stark divide reveals the moment when the last of the warm-adapted forests gave way to tundra and then to ice. It is not a slow fading that stretches across millions of years, but a sharp pivot in Earth's history. The sediments capture the silence that followed the forests, the long pause when life could no longer hold on against the cold. What makes these records even more remarkable is that they provide dates. By measuring the decay of isotopes and tracing the sequence of layers, scientists can pinpoint when Antarctica's final forests collapsed. The evidence suggests that around 34 million years ago, during the Eocene-Oligocene transition, the last green strongholds of Antarctica vanished. Within a geological instant, the continent moved from being a land of trees and rivers to being a land dominated by glaciers and wind. The sediments tell us not only what happened, but when, giving us a timeline for one of the most dramatic transformations in Earth's history. To imagine this timeline is to picture a book where every page is a year, every chapter a millennium, and yet at one point the story changes so quickly it feels like a sentence cut short. The rains fade, the vegetation vanishes, and the continent enters its frozen silence. Each core brought up from the seafloor is like holding that book in your hands, turning through the deep past until you reach the page where the forests end forever. And while these sediments record the death of Antarctica's forests, they also mark the beginning of something new. For as the ice spread across the land, it did not only bury what came before, it began to alter the very climate of the planet, reflecting sunlight, chilling the oceans, and reshaping Earth's rhythms. Antarctica was no longer only a victim of change, it was becoming the driver of a new, colder world. With the forests gone and the final collapse of vegetation recorded in the mud and stone, Antarctica was no longer a continent of green. It was now white, crowned with ice sheets that stretched across mountains and spilled into valleys, reflecting sunlight back into space. This reflective power, known as the albedo effect, changed not just the appearance of the continent, but the climate of the entire Earth. Sunlight that once warmed forests and rivers now bounced away from the gleaming surface of ice. Each beam of light that struck the frozen expanse carried energy that could no longer be absorbed by plants or soil. Instead, it was deflected, sent back into the atmosphere and beyond. The more the ice grew, the stronger this effect became. What had begun as a regional cooling in Antarctica spread outward, altering patterns of warmth and cold across the globe. This was the moment Antarctica became more than just a continent. It became a mirror, reflecting the sunlight's power and lowering the temperature of the entire planet. The chill that began at the bottom of the world slowly crept northward. Oceans cooled, atmospheric circulation shifted, and the balance of climates on every continent began to change. What had once been a greenhouse, Earth was becoming an icehouse Earth, a world where cycles of glaciation would dominate the rhythm of life. Sediment cores and deep sea records capture this transformation with clarity. For millions of years before the rise of Antarctica's ice, ocean temperatures had been consistently warm and life thrived in the seas. But around 34 million years ago, as the Antarctic ice sheets expanded, the chemistry of the ocean shifted. Oxygen isotopes in the shells of marine plankton reveal a sudden cooling, not just near Antarctica but across the planet. The fingerprints of the albedo effect are there in the oceans themselves, showing that the rise of Antarctic ice triggered global consequences. As the cooling spread northward, it set into motion a series of feedbacks that reshaped Earth's climate. Colder oceans absorbed more carbon dioxide, amplifying the chill. Winds changed course, strengthening the Antarctic circumpolar current and locking Antarctica's isolation even tighter. Monsoon patterns in Asia shifted, deserts expanded in some regions, and grasslands began to spread where forests once reigned. Antarctica was no longer only changing itself. It was beginning to sculpt the landscapes of distant continents. The most profound legacy of this transformation was the beginning of glacial cycles. Before Antarctica froze, Earth had been relatively stable, with warm climates dominating and only brief cool intervals interrupting them. Once the continent became encased in ice, however, the planet entered a new phase of climate history. The presence of a permanent ice sheet at the pole acted like a switch, amplifying the effects of changes in Earth's orbit and tilt. Small variations in the way our planet moved around the sun now had the power to trigger massive swings in climate, expanding and retreating ice sheets in cycles that lasted tens of thousands of years. This pattern would become the heartbeat of the planet's climate for millions of years to come. Antarctica, by holding its crown of ice, created the conditions for the ice ages that shaped the evolution of life and landscapes across the world. The glaciers that once carved North America, the massive ice sheets that once covered Europe, and the pulses of cold that drove human ancestors to adapt and migrate all trace their origins back to the transformation of Antarctica. Without its frozen deserts reflecting the sun, Earth might never have known such deep cycles of ice. The emotional weight of this shift is staggering. A continent that once nurtured rainforests and rivers became the architect of global chill. Its silence, enforced by ice and wind, echoed far beyond its shores, setting into motion patterns that reached as far as the equator. Antarctica had become a guardian of cold, a force that dictated when and where life could flourish or fade. And yet, this was not the end of its story. Even in its frozen state, the land beneath the ice remained restless, mountains rose, volcanoes simmered unseen, and hidden ecosystems continued to linger in secret pockets. As Antarctica tightened its grip on the planet's climate, the stage was being set for the next revelation, how life itself adapted to the frozen kingdom, clinging to survival in ways that continue to astonish us today. Even as the ice spread across Antarctica and the continent turned into a frozen desert, life did not vanish completely. The great forests and reptiles had fallen silent, the marsupials and birds had disappeared, and the rivers that once supported crocodiles and turtles had frozen over. But life has a way of holding on, even in the most impossible places. In Antarctica's darkest age, survivors emerged, each shaped by the harsh new world. Some took to the icy seas, some hid in secret places beneath the glaciers, and some evolved to thrive where almost nothing else could endure. Among the most iconic of these survivors were the penguins. Long before Antarctica became locked in ice, their ancestors had lived along its coasts, hunting in the rich seas. As the land froze and the forests collapsed, the penguins remained, but they changed. Those that had once stood taller than humans, the giant penguins of the Eocene, faded into extinction. In their place rose smaller, more specialized species, perfectly adapted to the freezing waters and endless winters of the new Antarctica. Their bodies grew more streamlined for swimming, their feathers thickened into waterproof armor, and layers of fat beneath their skin allowed them to dive deep into icy waters that would kill most other birds. Penguins became the heirs of the Antarctic coasts, colonies huddling together through storms, sharing warmth in the bitter cold. Their black and white forms became symbols of resilience, moving in harmony with the rhythm of ice and sea. Even when the katabatic winds roared and the sunlight vanished for months, they endured, waiting patiently for the return of light and the chance to fish again in the frigid waters. In many ways, penguins embody the spirit of Antarctica itself, survivors sculpted by extremes. But not all life clung to the coasts. Beneath the glaciers, in places hidden from the sunlight for millions of years, another kind of survivor emerged. Microbes, ancient and adaptable, found ways to live in the darkness. They evolved to feed not on sunlight, but on the minerals and chemical reactions deep below the ice. Some used traces of iron, sulfur, or methane to sustain themselves, drawing energy from the bedrock and from the faint trickles of water that moved through cracks beneath the glaciers. To humans, these places might seem utterly inhospitable, but to microbes, they became refuges where life could continue unseen. Scientists drilling into subglacial lakes in Antarctica have discovered entire microbial ecosystems sealed away under kilometers of ice. These organisms live in conditions colder, darker, and more isolated than almost anywhere else on Earth, yet they are not weak remnants of life clinging to survival. They are thriving communities, adapted so completely to their environment that they would die if exposed to the surface. Their resilience shows us that life does not need light or warmth to persist. It only needs a source of energy and the ability to adapt. Then there are the extremophiles, the organisms whose very name means lovers of extremes. These are microbes that flourish in environments where no other life can endure. In Antarctica, they inhabit frozen lakes, rich in salt, soils blasted by ultraviolet light, and vents where volcanic heat seeps through the ice. Some survive in brine so salty that it remains liquid even at sub-zero temperatures. Others endure cycles of freezing and thawing that would shatter most cells. They repair themselves, resist the stress, and keep living. The existence of these extremophiles stretches our understanding of what life can be. On the coldest, driest continent on Earth, where storms rage and sunlight disappears for months, they show not just survival but adaptation. Their persistence suggests that if life can endure here, it might also exist in other icy worlds beyond our own, in places like Europa or Enceladus, moons with hidden oceans beneath frozen shells. Antarctica's survivors remind us that resilience is written into the very code of life. The story of survival in Antarctica is not one of abundance but of endurance. Penguins reshaped by ice, microbes hidden beneath glaciers, and extremophiles flourishing in impossible niches all prove that even in a land stripped of forests and warmth, life refuses to surrender. Each of these survivors is a thread connecting the green past to the frozen present, keeping alive the spark of life that once filled Antarctica with forests, rivers, and animals. And as these survivors endured, they became part of a new story. Beneath miles of ice, where darkness reigns, lakes of liquid water remained sealed for millions of years. In these lakes, scientists believe entire hidden ecosystems may have survived, holding secrets about Antarctica's past and perhaps about life's deepest resilience. Beneath the weight of Antarctica's ice, where the surface is a frozen desert of wind and silence, something unexpected has endured. For a long time, scientists believed the continent was nothing but solid ice resting on lifeless rock. But as radar and drilling technology advanced, a secret world began to reveal itself. Hidden far below, sealed off for millions of years, lie lakes of liquid water, some larger than entire countries. These subglacial lakes are among the most mysterious features on Earth, places where light has not touched the water in more than 15 million years, yet where life may still be quietly waiting. One of the greatest of these hidden lakes is Lake Vostok, buried under nearly 4 kilometers of ice in East Antarctica. Stretching over 200 kilometers in length and 50 kilometers across, it is one of the largest freshwater lakes on the planet, rivaling even Lake Ontario in size. Despite the crushing pressure of ice above it and the complete absence of sunlight, its waters remain liquid, warmed faintly from geothermal heat rising from Earth's interior and kept from freezing by the sheer weight of the ice pressing down. To imagine Lake Vostok is to picture an alien world beneath our feet. There is no sky, no seasons, no day or night. Instead, there is darkness unbroken for millions of years, a sealed ecosystem locked away like a time capsule. In its depths, scientists suspect, may lie organisms that adapted to conditions unlike any we know on the surface. If life exists there, it has endured in isolation since long before humans ever appeared, perhaps even since the days when Antarctica was green with rainforests. Drilling into this hidden realm has been one of the most delicate scientific challenges of our time. Researchers have had to be careful not to contaminate the pristine waters with modern microbes. When small samples of ice that froze upward from Lake Vostok were finally retrieved, they contained hints of microbial DNA. While the results are still debated, they raise a tantalizing possibility that entire microbial communities live in these hidden waters, surviving on nutrients locked in rocks and chemicals dissolved in the lake. Some might even be descendants of organisms that thrived in Antarctica's ancient forests, evolving slowly as the continent froze above them. Lake Vostok is not alone. More than 400 subglacial lakes have been identified across Antarctica, connected by hidden channels where meltwater flows slowly beneath the ice. Each lake is a pocket of liquid water sealed away for eons, a potential refuge for life in a continent otherwise dominated by ice. Some are small, little more than ponds compared to Vostok's vast expanse. Others stretch for dozens of kilometers, their waters rich with minerals leached from the surrounding rock. Together, they form a hidden network beneath the frozen surface, a secret Antarctica beneath the Antarctica we know. These lakes are important not only for the mystery of what they might hold, but also for what they teach us about survival. They show us that even in the most extreme environments, where temperatures above are colder than -60 degrees Celsius, liquid water can still exist, and where there is water, life often finds a way. Extremophiles that thrive in darkness, pressure, and cold may flourish in these lakes, forming ecosystems sustained not by sunlight, but by chemical reactions in the water and sediments. The thought that microbes might still be living in Lake Vostok or in one of the many other hidden lakes is breathtaking. It means that traces of the rainforest age may still exist, not as fossilized pollen or bones, but as living organisms that adapted and survived in the shadows. If true, they would be the oldest survivors of Antarctica's green past, a direct link across tens of millions of years from a world of warmth and abundance to one of silence and ice. The mystery of these lakes also stretches beyond our planet. If life can survive in Lake Vostok, sealed away under kilometers of ice without sunlight, it strengthens the possibility that life could exist on icy moons like Europa or Enceladus, where oceans are buried beneath frozen crusts. Antarctica's hidden lakes are not only windows into Earth's past, but also into the possibilities of life elsewhere in the universe. As the search continues, each new discovery beneath Antarctica's ice deepens the story of survival. What was once thought to be a dead continent has revealed itself to be layered with secrets, from penguins on its coasts to microbes beneath its glaciers, and now to vast lakes sealed in darkness. The continent is not just a frozen wasteland, but a place where life lingers in the most unlikely corners, waiting patiently for us to find it. And beneath those layers of ice and water, another record still waits. Ice itself, with its bubbles and trapped gases, holds the memory of ancient atmospheres, carrying the signatures of carbon dioxide and oxygen from millions of years ago. To uncover those records is to see not only how life survived, but how the very air of our planet has shifted through the ages. The hidden lakes beneath Antarctica tell us that life can endure in silence and darkness, but life is only part of the story. To understand why the continent transformed so completely, scientists have turned to two very different kinds of records: the ancient forests preserved in stone, and the ice itself, which has captured bubbles of air from long-vanished atmospheres. One is a memory written in living tissue turned to fossil. The other is a memory frozen in time, sealed in ice for hundreds of thousands of years. Together, they tell us how carbon and climate have danced together across Earth's history. Deep within Antarctica's fossil beds, the remains of ancient forests still lie preserved. Roots, leaves, and even entire tree trunks, turned to stone, reveal not only what species grew there, but also the conditions they lived in. By studying the structure of leaves and the spacing of stomata, the tiny pores plants use to breathe, scientists can estimate how much carbon dioxide was in the air when those trees were alive. In times when stomata were fewer, it meant the air was thick with carbon dioxide, and plants needed fewer openings to take in what they required. In times when stomata were more abundant, it meant the air was leaner, and plants had to work harder to survive. These fossil forests, though silent, carry direct evidence of how the atmosphere once changed. In Antarctica's warmer past, the signal from these trees is clear. The levels of carbon dioxide were many times higher than they are today, allowing forests to grow even at the pole. They show us that the lush greenery of the Cretaceous and Eocene was not simply a product of geography, but of an atmosphere saturated with greenhouse gases. These fossil forests are windows into a world where Antarctica was alive with warmth and rain, where crocodiles and marsupials thrived under trees that breathed an entirely different kind of air. In contrast, the ice itself carries another kind of record. Within Antarctica's ice sheets are bubbles, tiny pockets of air trapped as snow fell, compacted, and froze over hundreds of thousands of years. Each bubble is a perfect sample of the atmosphere at the moment it was sealed. By drilling deep into the ice and bringing up long cylinders called ice cores, scientists can study these bubbles and reconstruct the composition of the atmosphere over time. Unlike the fossil forests, which capture conditions tens of millions of years ago, Ice cores preserve a more recent history, stretching back almost a million years. They show how carbon dioxide levels have risen and fallen in rhythm with the advance and retreat of ice ages. In layers of ice dating back 400,000 years, for example, carbon dioxide rises during warm interglacial periods, then falls during colder glacial stages. Each bubble, though impossibly small, tells of a world in motion, breathing in cycles that continue even now. When the records of fossil forests and ice cores are placed side by side, they create a map of Earth's carbon cycles that spans the deep past and the nearer present. The fossil forests reveal the long-term story, the greenhouse ages when carbon dioxide was high and Antarctica was green. The ice cores reveal the short-term story, the repeated glacial cycles of the last million years, when Antarctica was already locked in ice, but its grip on the planet's climate pulsed in step with changes in carbon. Together, these records tell us something profound. Carbon is the thread connecting life, climate, and the shape of continents. When it fills the air in abundance, forests thrive even in polar latitudes, seas rise, and the earth grows warm. When it falls, ice expands, seas drop, and deserts spread. The fossil forests and the ice cores are two voices telling the same truth. Antarctica has always been tied to carbon, and carbon has always been tied to the fate of life. To hold a fossil leaf and an ice core side by side is to see the full spectrum of Earth's memory. One is a relic of warmth, whispering of trees that shaded dinosaurs and giant penguins. The other is a relic of cold, holding the breath of mammoths and early humans. Each captures a moment in time, and together they reveal a cycle that spans millions of years, a cycle that has shaped our world and continues to shape it still. And from this marriage of stone and ice, the story of Antarctica widens once again. For once the ice sheets were firmly in place, their power reached far beyond the continent. They became the engines of the ice ages, locking Earth into a rhythm of glaciation that would shape the evolution of life across the globe. Once Antarctica was fully encased in ice, its influence reached far beyond its frozen shores. The continent became more than just a passive block of land at the bottom of the world. It became an engine, driving the great rhythms of Earth's climate. The vast white surface reflected sunlight back into space, keeping the planet cooler than it had been for millions of years. The glaciers that locked away unimaginable volumes of water shaped global sea levels, altering coastlines across the world. And its interaction with Earth's orbit and tilt pushed the planet into a cycle of repeating ice ages, a pattern that still echoes today. The ice sheet of Antarctica was not simply large, it was colossal, covering more than 14 million square kilometers and holding enough frozen water to raise the oceans by over 50 meters if it were to melt. Its weight pressed down on the crust of the Earth, its thickness rising over 4 kilometers in places, and its cold stretched outward into the atmosphere and the seas. The sheer scale of this ice gave it the power to set the pace of global climate. Yet the rhythm of the ice ages was not dictated by Antarctica alone. It was the result of a delicate dance between the frozen continent and the way Earth moves around the Sunday. Our planet does not orbit in perfect uniformity over cycles lasting tens of thousands of years. Earth's tilt wobbles, its orbit stretches and contracts, and its axis slowly shifts. These changes, known as Milankovitch cycles, alter how much sunlight reaches the poles. On their own, these cycles create only small variations in temperature, but with Antarctica in place, as a frozen mirror, those small changes were magnified into dramatic swings. When Earth tilted in such a way that the poles received less sunlight, Antarctica's ice sheet grew. Its white surface reflected even more sunlight, reinforcing the cooling and causing ice sheets to expand across the northern hemisphere as well. Sea levels dropped, climates shifted, and deserts spread across continents. The planet entered a deep freeze, with glaciers stretching down from Canada and Scandinavia, carving valleys and covering landscapes in ice. When the tilt shifted again and the poles received more sunlight, the process reversed. Some of Antarctica's ice retreated, sea levels rose, and northern hemisphere ice sheets melted back. But even during these warmer interglacial periods, Antarctica remained frozen at its core. Its permanence kept the planet locked into a colder overall state than the greenhouse worlds of earlier ages. The result was a cycle, repeating every 20,000 to 100,000 years, where Earth swung between icy ages and warmer intervals. The sediments of the deep oceans record this rhythm with astonishing clarity. Layers of tiny plankton shells show oxygen isotope ratios that reflect the rise and fall of global ice volumes. Every peak and valley in those records aligns with changes in Earth's orbit and with the growth and retreat of Antarctic ice. What began as subtle wobbles in our planet's path around the sun became amplified into world-changing events by the frozen mass of Antarctica. For life, these cycles were both a challenge and a force of change. Entire species were shaped by the repeated contractions and expansions of ice. In colder periods, animals and plants were pushed into refuges closer to the equator. In warmer periods, they spread northward again. Human evolution itself was influenced by these cycles, as shifting climates forced our ancestors to adapt to changing environments, to migrate, and to develop new survival strategies. Antarctica, though distant and unseen, was one of the key players in this drama, setting the rhythm of the ice ages that guided the course of life. The emotional weight of this realization is profound. A single continent, transformed into a block of ice, reshaped the destiny of the planet. The forests of the Eocene and the rainforests of Gondwana were long gone, but their absence created a world that oscillated between extremes. Antarctica became the planet's great pendulum, swinging the Earth between glacial and interglacial states. And even as it locked the planet into cycles of deep freeze, the continent was not entirely still. Beneath the miles of ice, mountains were rising, volcanoes were stirring, and tectonic forces continued their slow reshaping. Antarctica, frozen on the surface, remained alive beneath, a land of hidden power that would continue to influence the world in ways scientists are still uncovering. Though Antarctica appeared silent once ice had claimed it, the land beneath the frozen surface was never truly still. Beneath the crushing weight of glaciers, the continent remained alive, restless with tectonic forces and hidden fire. Mountains continued to rise, volcanoes simmered in darkness, and deep within the crust, the slow churning of Earth's interior kept pushing and pulling at the land. What we see today as a frozen desert is in fact a place of dramatic geologic motion, its heart still beating beneath the ice. One of the most striking features of Antarctica's buried landscape is the Transantarctic Mountains. This vast chain stretches for more than 3,000 kilometers, dividing East Antarctica from West Antarctica, and ranks among the longest mountain ranges on Earth. Unlike ranges such as the Himalayas or the Andes, which are still pushed upward by the collision of continents, the Transantarctic Mountains were uplifted by more complex forces. As Antarctica shifted and rifted apart during its long journey southward, blocks of the crust tilted and rose, creating a towering barrier that still stands today, even under its icy shroud. The uplift of these mountains shaped more than just the land. It redirected glaciers, splitting their paths and guiding the flow of ice toward the sea. Valleys between the peaks became funnels for katabatic winds, intensifying the freezing gales that swept outward from the interior. Fossils found along the exposed edges of the range reveal glimpses of Antarctica's green past, but the mountains themselves, rising steadily through time, are reminders that the continent was never static. Even as forests collapsed and ice spread, tectonic forces continued to sculpt the land. Hidden within and around these mountains are volcanoes, silent giants buried beneath kilometers of ice. Some are long extinct, their craters filled and sealed by glaciers. Others remain active, their heat rising invisibly into the frozen world above. One of the most remarkable is Mount Erebus, standing over 3,700 meters tall on Ross Island. It is not only the southernmost active volcano on Earth, but also one that hosts a permanent lava lake, glowing red in defiance of the white wilderness around it. To stand near Erebus is to feel the paradox of Antarctica, a land of fire hidden within a realm of ice. But Erebus is not alone. Dozens of other volcanoes lie beneath the ice sheets, detected by radar and seismic surveys. Some still release heat, creating pockets of liquid water beneath the glaciers. These geothermal oases may help explain how subglacial lakes, such as Lake Vostok, remain liquid despite being sealed away under kilometers of ice. In some places, volcanic heat weakens the base of the ice sheet, allowing glaciers to slide more quickly toward the ocean. Antarctica, far from being geologically dead, is a continent with fire in its core, influencing even the behavior of the ice that covers it. The landmass itself is riddled with rift valleys, faults, and zones of stretching crust. West Antarctica, in particular, shows signs of ongoing motion, as if the continent there is slowly being pulled apart. Beneath the ice lies a landscape of deep basins, ridges, and hidden mountain ranges, all the result of tectonic forces that never cease their work. Satellites that measure the gravitational pull of the Earth show that Antarctica's crust is still adjusting under the weight of its massive ice sheets. Where glaciers have retreated, the land is rising upward in response, slowly springing back after being pressed down for millions of years. To imagine Antarctica from below is to picture a land of extraordinary contrasts. Mountains higher than the Alps lie hidden under the ice. Volcanoes glow with heat in complete darkness. Valleys plunge deeper than the Grand Canyon, carved first by tectonic rifting and then by glaciers grinding their way across the land. This buried world is invisible to the eye, but alive with motion, a reminder that beneath the silence of ice, Earth's restless heart continues to beat. And as these tectonic and volcanic forces shape the continent from below, they also influence the climate above. Heat from volcanoes alters the stability of glaciers, sometimes hastening their slide toward the ocean. The uplift of mountains affects winds, storms, and the flow of ice. Antarctica may appear frozen into stillness, but every peak, every valley, and every plume of heat beneath the ice tells a story of a land that never truly sleeps. From this hidden tectonic drama, the story of Antarctica's influence on the planet only grows deeper. For the rise of its mountains and the spread of its ice did not only change the land itself, they also changed the very balance of carbon in the atmosphere. As glaciers advanced, they became vast traps for carbon, locking it away and further cooling the earth. As mountains rose beneath the ice and volcanoes flickered with hidden fire, the glaciers above grew ever thicker, spreading their frozen reach across the land. These vast ice sheets did more than transform the shape of Antarctica. They became enormous vaults, not only locking away water, but also playing a powerful role in storing carbon. In doing so, Antarctica became a silent regulator of the planet's atmosphere, tipping the balance of climate far beyond its borders. When forests once covered the continent, carbon flowed freely between air, plants, and soil. Trees breathed it in, storing it in trunks and roots, then releasing it again when they died or decayed. With the collapse of the forests and the spread of ice, that cycle was broken. The glaciers buried the soils that had once released carbon, sealing them away under frozen layers. Rivers that carried carbon-rich sediments were choked by advancing ice, trapping what they once delivered to the seas. Even the air itself began to shift, as Antarctica's growing cold pulled carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The process was subtle at first, but grew stronger as the ice sheets thickened. Cold water absorbs more carbon dioxide than warm water, and as the Southern Ocean cooled, it began to draw in greater amounts of gas from the air. The circulation of the Antarctic circumpolar current mixed those waters, carrying carbon into the depths of the ocean where it could be stored for millennia. In this way, Antarctica did not just freeze itself into silence. It also began freezing part of the atmosphere, locking carbon away in oceans and ice. The evidence of this process is written in ice cores. Tiny bubbles trapped within the frozen layers show the precise levels of carbon dioxide in the air over hundreds of thousands of years. Again and again, the pattern appears. When Antarctica cooled and its ice expanded, carbon dioxide levels fell. When some of the ice retreated during warmer intervals, the levels rose again. The ice itself became both the recorder and the regulator of the planet's carbon cycle, breathing in and out across vast timescales. But the influence of Antarctica reached even farther. By storing carbon, it amplified the cooling of the planet. With less carbon dioxide in the air, less heat was trapped, and global temperatures continued to drop. This feedback loop bound Earth into a colder state, one that would persist for tens of millions of years. The ice ages of the northern hemisphere, the shifting deserts and grasslands of Africa, even the patterns of monsoons in Asia, all trace part of their origin back to Antarctica's silent grip on carbon. To picture this influence is to imagine a giant unseen hand on Earth's thermostat. The ice sheets, gleaming white under the polar sun, reflected light away, while simultaneously helping to drain greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. No other continent has ever held such power over the climate. Antarctica became not just a landmass, but a stabilizer of the entire planet, a cold regulator that controlled the flow of carbon and the rhythm of heat. What is striking is how completely this transformation rewrote Earth's systems. For hundreds of millions of years, before Antarctica froze, carbon dioxide levels had been high, keeping the planet warm and lush with life even at the poles. The sudden decline in carbon, driven by cooling seas, buried soils, and locked away carbon in ice, was enough to flip the planet from greenhouse to icehouse. It was not only a local event, but a planetary shift, altering the course of evolution for every living thing. Even today, Antarctica continues to act as this silent regulator. The Southern Ocean remains one of the greatest carbon sinks on Earth, absorbing vast amounts of carbon dioxide from the air each year. The ice sheets themselves hold records of past levels, allowing us to see how closely carbon and climate are linked. And as they grow or retreat, they influence how much carbon the seas can hold, pushing the planet into balance or imbalance with each change. This role of Antarctica as a carbon trap is not only a story of the past, but also a warning for the future. The same processes that locked carbon away during its freezing have begun to unravel as modern warming melts glaciers and disrupts ocean currents. The regulator is shifting once again, and the consequences will ripple across the entire planet. And as Antarctica holds this central role in Earth's climate engine, its surface is also home to extremes unlike anywhere else, where winds roar and blizzards rage. Above the silent carbon vaults, the weather itself tells the story of a continent that has become the fiercest environment on the planet. Above the buried carbon vaults, and beneath the wide white sky, Antarctica became home to some of the harshest weather ever recorded on Earth. It is a land where wind itself seems alive, sculpting the ice and punishing anything that dares to stand in its way. What began with the spread of glaciers and the rise of katabatic winds in the ancient past has grown into the fiercest climate regime on the planet, one that has tested explorers, broken machines, and humbled even the strongest human efforts to endure it. The story begins with the winds. Katabatic winds are born from cold, heavy air pooling on Antarctica's high interior plateau. As this air chills further under the clear polar skies, it grows denser and heavier, and gravity pulls it downward with unstoppable force. Flowing off the high ice sheets, it rushes through valleys and across plains, gathering speed until it becomes a roaring torrent of frozen air. These winds can exceed 200 kilometers an hour, faster than the fiercest hurricanes elsewhere, yet they blow with relentless constancy rather than the short bursts of tropical storms. To stand in such winds would be impossible. They flatten tents, scour the surface of the snow into sharp ridges called sastrugi, and tear away heat from any exposed skin in seconds. Even the strongest structures strain against them, while weaker ones are simply carried away. These katabatic winds define Antarctica's personality, the voice of the continent echoing across the frozen wilderness. Alongside the winds come the blizzards. In most parts of the world, blizzards are storms of snow falling from the sky, but in Antarctica, they are something different. Here, snow rarely falls in great amounts. Instead, the blizzards are born when the katabatic winds lift loose snow from the surface and whip it into blinding clouds. Visibility drops to nothing. The horizon vanishes, the sky and ground blend into a single sheet of white, and even a person standing only a few steps away disappears into the storm. These whiteouts can last for hours, days, or even weeks. For early explorers, trapped in flimsy shelters of canvas, the blizzards were nightmares that seemed to have no end. Dogs, sledges, and supplies were swallowed by the blowing snow. Navigation became impossible as compasses spun uselessly and landmarks vanished in the shifting white haze. To move during such storms was to invite death, for even a short distance could mean becoming hopelessly lost. In modern times, the blizzards remain just as dangerous. Aircraft are grounded for weeks, stations are sealed off, and scientists wait in enforced isolation while the storms rage outside. During these periods, the world becomes soundless but for the unending roar of the wind and the rattle of ice against walls. The power of Antarctica's weather isolates not only its land but also its people, cutting them off as surely as the seas and the ice do. The extremes of Antarctica do not end with its winds and blizzards. Temperatures plunge lower here than anywhere else on Earth. On the East Antarctic Plateau, the thermometer has fallen below -90 degrees Celsius, a cold so deep it can freeze metal brittle and turn breath into shards of ice. Even in coastal regions, where the sea offers some measure of warmth, winter temperatures often stay below -40. This frozen isolation is not just the product of latitude, but of the entire continent being ringed by the Antarctic circumpolar current and sealed off from the flow of heat from other parts of the world. The silence of Antarctica's vast interior hides the violence of its weather. On the surface, it may appear still, a white plain stretching endlessly under a blue sky. But beneath that stillness lies a constant battle of air and ice, of gravity pulling winds down slopes and storms rising out of nothing but loose snow. It is a place where weather is not only a condition to endure, but a force that shapes the land and dictates the survival of everything upon it. And while the extremes of Antarctica's weather have driven away most life, they also set the stage for some of the first humans to encounter the continent. When ships finally reached its coasts in the 19th century, explorers were confronted with a world so alien and unforgiving that they could scarcely believe it was part of Earth at all. When the first humans set eyes on Antarctica in the early 19th century, they were stepping into the final blank space on the map of Earth. Every other continent had long been charted, explored, and crossed, but the great southern land remained hidden behind fog, storms, and seas filled with drifting icebergs. For centuries, its existence had been more of a myth than a certainty, imagined as terra australis incognita, the unknown southern land, a balance to the continents of the north. Sailors whispered of it, philosophers debated it, and cartographers sketched its possible outline, but no one had truly seen it. That changed in the year 1820, when expeditions from Russia, Britain, and the United States pushed farther south than anyone before them. As they sailed through treacherous waters filled with ice floes, they glimpsed what at first looked like distant clouds on the horizon. But as they drew closer, they realized they were staring at the edges of a vast, ice-covered continent. Towering cliffs of ice rose above the waves, stretching endlessly in either direction. This was no island, no floating pack of frozen sea. It was land, and it was unlike anything they had expected. The shock of that first sight was profound. Explorers had imagined that Antarctica might be a place of hidden valleys, perhaps even fertile plains where green life could thrive. Some speculated it could be a counterpart to South America or Africa, with rich soils and resources waiting to be uncovered. Instead, what they found was a world stripped bare. No forests greeted them. No rivers or meadows rolled down to the sea. What met their eyes was silence, a continent buried beneath ice and wind, lifeless as far as they could see. The disbelief was so deep that many of the early accounts lingered on the emptiness itself. The sailors described the land as desolation without end. The ice cliffs were described as walls, sheer and impenetrable, holding back whatever secrets might lie beyond. For men who had traveled the world and seen jungles, deserts, and mountains, the shock of encountering a place that seemed so utterly void of life was overwhelming. They wrote of its silence, its cold, and its starkness as though they had stumbled not upon another corner of Earth, but another planet entirely. Yet even in their disbelief, curiosity burned. Many wondered if the continent's interior might hide a different reality. Perhaps, they speculated, the ice was only a coastal feature, and deeper inland there might be hidden valleys untouched by the cold. Some believed warm winds or volcanic heat could support life in sheltered basins, hidden oases preserved in secret. These ideas were fed by the fact that Antarctica was so vast, no one could truly imagine what lay within. To those who only saw the edges, the possibility of green lands concealed within the frozen shell was irresistible. The early explorers struggled to reconcile what they saw with what they had hoped to find. James Clark Ross, leading his famous British expedition in the 1840s, described the continent as a place both majestic and terrifying. His ships sailed along the edge of the ice barrier that would later bear his name, the Ross Ice Shelf, a wall of frozen cliffs rising more than 30 meters above the sea. It stretched so far that it seemed endless, a fortress of ice that refused to yield. Ross and his men marveled at its scale but despaired at its emptiness, realizing they could not break through to see what lay beyond. For others, like the sealers and whalers who ventured south in search of new hunting grounds, the shock was practical as well as emotional. They had expected rich coasts filled with animals. Instead, they found scarcity. Only scattered penguin colonies and a few seals clung to life along the icy shores. The lifelessness of Antarctica was not only surprising, but disappointing to those who had risked everything to reach it. And yet, despite their dismay, the image of Antarctica burned itself into the human imagination. It was not lush or welcoming. It was stark, alien, and merciless. But in that very severity lay its fascination. The continent that had been the last to be seen by human eyes became the one that most powerfully reminded us of Earth's extremes. Its silence and its emptiness stood as a testament to the planet's ability to change, to freeze, and to defy expectation. As the 19th century moved forward, more ships pressed southward, determined to see beyond the ice cliffs. Each voyage added to the mystery, confirming the lifelessness of the coasts, but also deepening the questions about what lay hidden within. And as they returned with their stories, they prepared the stage for the next wave of discovery, when science would begin to strip back the veil of Antarctica's silence and reveal the truths buried beneath its ice. The first explorers returned from Antarctica with stories of endless ice, walls of glaciers, and coasts stripped bare of life. To them, the continent seemed unknowable, a place beyond human reach. But in the centuries that followed, science began to find ways of peeling back its layers, revealing secrets that no sailor staring at its cliffs could have imagined. What had once been mystery slowly became discovery, and each breakthrough transformed our understanding of this frozen land. The revolution began not on the ice itself, but above it, in orbit. Satellites gave scientists a way to see beneath the white shroud, using radar and gravity measurements to map what lay hidden. For the first time, the contours of Antarctica's buried landscape were revealed. Beneath the ice sheets, entire mountain ranges emerged on the maps, peaks and valleys concealed for millions of years. The Gamburtsev Mountains, for example, were discovered deep under East Antarctica. These mountains, as tall as the Alps, had been completely hidden under more than a kilometer of ice. Their presence stunned scientists. How could such a massive range exist without any clue from the surface? The discovery suggested that Antarctica was not a flat, uniform block of frozen rock, but a land as dramatic and diverse as any other continent. Other satellite data showed rift valleys, deep basins, and ancient rivers now frozen into silence. Gravity measurements revealed where ice was thickest, and radar pulses bouncing through the ice mapped where hidden lakes of liquid water lay waiting. From above, Antarctica was no longer a blank spot on the map, but a living, dynamic landmass with a buried geography every bit as complex as the visible continents of the world. But mapping was only the beginning. To truly understand what Antarctica had been, scientists needed to dig into it, to touch the layers of earth and ice that held its history. Drilling projects began to bore deep into the continent, extracting cores of ice and sediment. These cores were more than cylinders of frozen water or mud. They were scrolls of time, each layer a page written with the record of Earth's past. One of the most extraordinary discoveries came when drilling into layers beneath the ice revealed fossilized remains of rainforests. Trapped within sediments, buried for tens of millions of years, were the roots, pollen, and leaves of plants that once grew in Antarctica's ancient warmth. Some cores even contained impressions of wood and spores from ferns, showing that dense forests had once thrived where glaciers now stretch endlessly. These fossils were not the eroded fragments of stone leaves we might imagine, but delicate, detailed evidence that a vibrant ecosystem had once flourished. They confirmed that Antarctica had once been a land of greenery, warmed by high carbon dioxide levels and bathed in long days of summer light. Other drilling projects unearthed fossils of animals as well, bones of marsupials, shells of marine creatures, and even traces of giant penguins that once roamed the coasts. Each discovery added depth to the story. Antarctica was no longer a place defined only by its ice. It was a continent with a deep memory of rainforests, rivers, and life that had thrived before the cold took hold. The combination of satellite vision and drilling transformed polar science into something new. Scientists could now connect the dots between ancient forests, revealed in cores, hidden mountains mapped from orbit, and modern ice that continued to shift and flow. Antarctica was no longer a distant, lifeless desert. It was a laboratory for understanding Earth itself, a place where past and present work together to reveal how climate, life, and geology intertwine. This revolution in polar science also expanded human imagination. If rainforests once grew at the South Pole, what does that say about how fragile and changeable Earth's climate can be? If life exists in sealed lakes beneath the glaciers, could it also exist in frozen oceans on distant moons? If Antarctica's ice once grew so vast that it drove the planet into cycles of ice ages, what will happen if that ice now begins to melt? Every satellite image, every drilled core, every fossil leaf or bone pulled from beneath the ice brought new clarity to the story of this extraordinary land. Antarctica had once shocked explorers with its lifeless silence. Now it was shocking scientists with its buried history, a reminder that even the coldest and most desolate places on Earth carry memories of warmth, life, and transformation. And with this new understanding came another realization. Antarctica's story was not finished. As modern warming began to unravel parts of its frozen grip, the future of the continent became a question as pressing as its past. The story of Antarctica has always been one of transformation, from forests to glaciers, from warmth to silence. Yet the continent's tale is not finished. Today, in our own lifetime, Antarctica is changing once again, and the speed of that change is unsettling. Where once ice advanced and locked the planet into cycles of cold, modern warming is beginning to unravel its frozen grip. What had taken tens of millions of years to form now trembles under the weight of just a few centuries of human activity. The first signs of this shift appear at the edges, along Antarctica's vast shelves of floating ice. These shelves are extensions of the continent's glaciers, immense slabs that stretch out over the sea, some the size of small countries. For centuries, they held steady, their weight anchoring the inland ice sheets, but in recent decades, satellites and expeditions have documented cracks spreading through them like veins of weakness. In some places, the shelves have collapsed entirely, disintegrating in a matter of weeks into armadas of icebergs. The Larsen B ice shelf, for example, which had stood for more than 10,000 years, shattered suddenly in the year 2002, releasing an area of ice larger than the island of Jamaica into the sea. When shelves collapse, the glaciers behind them surge forward, no longer held back by their frozen barricades. The result is an acceleration of ice flowing into the ocean, raising sea levels across the globe. This is not a distant concern for future generations. Tide gauges and satellites already show the seas creeping higher year by year, and Antarctica is now one of the greatest contributors. If the West Antarctic ice sheet were to melt entirely, it would raise global sea levels by more than 3 meters. If all of Antarctica's ice were lost, the rise would exceed 50 meters, enough to redraw the maps of every coastline on Earth. The danger is not only in the numbers but in the speed. Ice sheets are vast, but they are not immovable. Once warming reaches a threshold, collapse can happen rapidly, with glaciers retreating dozens of kilometers in only a few decades. Scientists fear that some parts of West Antarctica may already have passed such a tipping point, their grounding lines, the places where ice clings to bedrock below sea level, retreating irreversibly. As seawater slips beneath these glaciers, it melts them from below, speeding the process further. The effects of this thaw ripple far beyond the icy continent. Rising seas threaten coastal cities, from New York to Shanghai, from London to Lagos. Small island nations may vanish beneath the waves, their people forced to abandon ancestral homelands. Storm surges, already dangerous, will reach farther inland, fueled by higher base sea levels. Even those far from the coasts will feel the changes, as melting Antarctica alters ocean circulation, weather patterns, and the balance of carbon in the air. To imagine this future is to reverse the story told in Fossils and Cores. Where once Antarctica cooled the planet by locking carbon away, now its thawing risks releasing it again. Beneath the ice lie sediments rich in organic material, frozen for millions of years. As warming continues, some of this material may decay, adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and intensifying the very problem that caused the thaw. The frozen regulator of Earth's climate could shift into a source of instability. For humanity, the challenge is immense. We are no longer passive witnesses to Antarctica's transformations. Our emissions of greenhouse gases, rising relentlessly since the Industrial Revolution, are directly tied to the continent's fate. The story of Antarctica's melting is also the story of us, of choices made in factories, cities, and homes, choices that echo even at the bottom of the world. And yet, within this sobering reality, there is also clarity. Antarctica shows us in the starkest way possible that Earth is not unchanging. It is alive, responsive, and fragile. The collapse of an ice shelf is not only a local event but a planetary signal, a warning written in fractures of blue ice and walls of crashing glaciers. To see it is to realize that the future is not distant. It is already unfolding, one crack, one meltwater stream, one rising tide at a time. From here, the story of Antarctica flows naturally into echoes of its past, for the fossils locked beneath its ice do not only tell of what once was, they whisper of thresholds, of times when high carbon dioxide turned the poles green, and they remind us that the boundary between an icehouse world and a greenhouse world has always been thin. The story of Antarctica's melting future leads naturally back into its past, for the ice is not only retreating into an uncertain tomorrow, but also revealing memories of worlds that existed long before humans walked the earth. Fossils buried deep within its rocks and sediments remind us that this frozen land was once green, and they carry a warning written in stone. The conditions that gave rise to tropical forests at the South Pole were driven by carbon dioxide levels far higher than those of our modern world. As the atmosphere fills again with greenhouse gases, these echoes of a tropical Antarctica begin to sound less like distant history and more like a mirror held up to our possible future. The evidence is clear in fossilized roots, pollen, and leaves pulled from beneath kilometers of ice. These ancient plants tell us that during the Cretaceous, roughly 90 million years ago, carbon dioxide levels in the air were more than 4 times higher than they are today. Those concentrations trapped enough heat to keep the poles warm, with summer temperatures in Antarctica reaching 20 degrees Celsius and even the long winters softened by a greenhouse atmosphere. Crocodiles swam in rivers, marsupials moved through dense undergrowth, and forests stretched across lands that now lie buried under glaciers. The message of these fossils is not subtle. When carbon dioxide crosses a certain threshold, the poles cannot hold their ice. Heat spreads toward the extremes of the planet, and what should be frozen becomes green and wet. Antarctica's ancient rainforests stand as testimony that ice-free poles are not impossible fantasies, but natural states of the Earth under high greenhouse conditions. They remind us that the planet does not need to move mountains or summon extraordinary catastrophes to shift from ice to warmth. It needs only the accumulation of gas in the air, invisible yet powerful enough to rewrite the shape of continents. What makes these warnings even sharper is how they align with the present. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are now higher than at any time in the past 3 million years. Each year, humanity adds billions of tons more, and the line on the graph rises steadily upward. Though we are not yet near the levels that once supported rainforests at the South Pole, the climb shows no sign of stopping. If emissions continue unchecked, we may enter ranges that echo those ancient greenhouse ages. The consequences of returning to a world without polar ice would be profound. Seas would rise by tens of meters, drowning coastlines where billions of people live. Ocean circulation would shift dramatically, reshaping climates across every continent. The reflective power of ice, which has cooled the Earth for tens of millions of years, would vanish, replaced by darker seas that absorb heat and amplify warming further. The Earth of ice-free poles would not simply be warmer, it would be transformed, its rhythms of climate and life completely reshaped. Looking at these fossils is like holding a crystal ball made of stone. They do not speak in riddles or vague prophecies. They show, in the most physical way possible, what happens when greenhouse gases climb unchecked. The broadleaves fossilized under Antarctic ice, the spores of ferns preserved in sediments, the roots that once anchored towering trees all point to the same truth. Earth has been here before, and it can return again. This echo of the past is both humbling and haunting. It tells us that the stability we have known, with Antarctica locked in ice and sea levels steady enough to support civilizations, is fragile. It is a brief chapter in a much longer story, one that shifts between extremes of warmth and cold. The fossils remind us that ice is not permanent. It is a temporary state, one that depends entirely on the balance of carbon in the atmosphere. And so the past flows into the present, and the present flows into the future. If Antarctica's buried rainforests tell us that Earth once lived without polar ice, then its modern melting shows us how quickly the first steps toward that state can unfold. The fossils warn not only of what once was, but of what might come again if we ignore the lessons written in their silent forms. From here, the story of Antarctica broadens yet again. For if the continent has been both tropical and frozen, both forested and barren, then its role is not only as a witness to change, but as a guardian of balance. It has shaped the climate of the Earth for millions of years, and its loss would unravel weather and life across the globe. Antarctica has always been more than a continent. Beneath its ice and silence, it has worked as one of the great stabilizers of Earth's climate engine. From the moment it froze, it began to act as a giant regulator, cooling the planet, driving ocean currents, and shaping the cycles of glaciation that guided life's path. Though it looks barren, it is in many ways the heartbeat of the Earth, keeping the rhythms of weather, carbon, and oceans in delicate balance. Without it, the world as we know it would unravel. The power of Antarctica begins with its ice. Covering more than 14 million square kilometers, it reflects sunlight back into space like a mirror. This reflective surface, known as albedo, helps prevent the Earth from overheating, bouncing away radiation that would otherwise be absorbed by dark seas or soils. In this way, Antarctica cools not only itself, but the entire planet. Its white deserts shine outward, and the whole Earth feels the effect. The difference between an ice-covered Antarctica and an ice-free one is not a small adjustment. It is the difference between a climate that supports billions of people and one that could drown coastlines and alter seasons beyond recognition. The continent also acts as a driver of ocean circulation, which scientists call the global conveyor belt. Around Antarctica, the Antarctic circumpolar current flows endlessly, encircling the continent and linking the waters of the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. This current helps regulate the exchange of heat and nutrients across the globe, stirring the oceans and driving the deep circulation that carries carbon into the abyss. Without Antarctica's cold to fuel it, this engine of currents would weaken, and with it the balance of global climate would falter. The rains in the tropics, the monsoons of Asia, even the winds that cross the plains of North America are connected, indirectly but surely, to the frozen isolation of the South Pole. The ice sheets of Antarctica also serve as immense storage vaults of water and carbon. Locked within them are more than 26 million cubic kilometers of ice, enough to raise sea levels by over 50 meters if released. This frozen storehouse has kept coastlines stable for millions of years, allowing civilizations to flourish along the edges of seas. Beneath the ice, organic material and gases have been sealed away, trapped in sediments and permafrost that have not breathed for millions of years. So long as the ice remains, the planet remains stable. If it is lost, that stability collapses. The paradox of Antarctica is striking. It is the most extreme continent, a place of lifeless deserts, howling winds, and cold that can reach minus 90 degrees Celsius. Yet, it is precisely because of this extremity that it holds the planet in balance. Its hostility is its gift. By becoming uninhabitable, it became irreplaceable. By freezing, it preserved the climate that allowed other parts of the earth to thrive. Its silence is not emptiness but strength, a silence that anchors the rhythms of seas and skies everywhere else. But the guardian is fragile. Modern warming has begun to gnaw at its edges, breaking shelves, thinning glaciers, and threatening the very stability it provides. If Antarctica's ice were to vanish, the reflective albedo would disappear, oceans would darken, and warming would accelerate. The collapse of its shelves would flood cities, erase islands, and redraw the map of the world. More subtly, the breakdown of the Antarctic circumpolar current would unravel global weather, throwing monsoons, storms, and seasons into chaos. The very stability that made Antarctica a guardian would be undone, and with it the climate engine would spin into disorder. The image is both awe-inspiring and sobering. A land so distant, so extreme, so seemingly irrelevant to daily life, is in truth one of the most important pieces of the planet's machinery. It is the anchor that holds Earth's climate steady. The paradox is that the harshest, coldest continent has been humanity's greatest ally, shielding us with its frozen strength, regulating the carbon in the air, and keeping the seas and skies in balance. And as this realization comes into focus, the story of Antarctica draws toward its close. Its past as a tropical rainforest, its transformation into ice, its buried fossils and hidden lakes, its power to reshape the world and warn of the future all gather into one truth. The continent is not just land at the bottom of the world. It is the Earth's greatest teacher, reminding us of the violence of change, the fragility of balance, and the beauty of endurance. From the very first glimpse of Antarctica's hidden past, we have traveled together across a story almost too vast to grasp. We began in a time when the southernmost continent was not a land of white, but of green. Dense rainforests crowded its valleys, rivers carried crocodiles through their currents, and even dinosaurs walked beneath the low polar sundae. For millions of years, Antarctica thrived as a cradle of life, proof that Earth could be warm enough to spread abundance even to its most distant corners. Then came the shift, slow at first, but unstoppable. The carbon-rich skies began to clear, global cooling whispered into the atmosphere, and the first crystals of ice formed in hidden places. Antarctica, once a tropical sanctuary, began its long fall into silence. Its forests collapsed, its rivers froze, and its animals vanished into the fossil record. Ice swept across the land, carving valleys, grinding mountains, and reshaping the continent into the frozen giant we see today. The transformation was not only local. As Antarctica hardened into ice, it reached outward with invisible hands, cooling the seas, lowering the air's carbon, and locking Earth into cycles of glaciation. It became not only a victim of change, but a driver of it, the silent engine that powered ice ages and sculpted the path of life across the planet. And even now, under its heavy shroud, the continent remains alive. Mountains rise beneath the ice, volcanoes stir in secret, and hidden lakes cradle microbial worlds untouched for millions of years. Antarctica is not still. It is never still. Its paradox lies in this truth. The coldest, harshest desert on Earth is also its greatest guardian. By freezing, it stabilized the climate. By sealing itself in silence, it gave life elsewhere the chance to flourish. And yet, today, we stand on the edge of another change. The warming of the modern world is beginning to crack Antarctica's icy armor. Shelves collapse, glaciers retreat, and seas creep higher with every passing year. The past that once seemed distant now looks like a shadow of what may come again. The fossils whisper warnings. They tell us that when greenhouse gases climb too high, ice cannot hold. They remind us that Antarctica was green before, and it could be green again. To reflect on this is to feel both awe and unease. Antarctica proves that Earth is never still. It changes, violently, beautifully, and without mercy. It has been rainforest and desert, guardian and destroyer, silence and storm, and the same forces that reshaped it are still at work, forces we have now amplified. The question that hangs in the air is one we cannot ignore. Do you think Antarctica will thaw again? Will the frozen guardian of our world become, once more, a land of forests and rivers? And if it does, what will that mean for the billions of people who live along the world's coasts, for the climates that sustain our crops, for the balance that has allowed our civilizations to rise? These questions are not only scientific, they are deeply human, for Antarctica's story is our story too. It is a mirror of change, showing us the fragility of balance and the speed at which transformation can arrive. It is both history and prophecy, a record of what was and a warning of what may be. If you've felt the weight of this journey, if the silence of Antarctica has spoken to you as it has to me, I invite you to stay with us in this quiet corner of science and story. Give this video a gentle like, and if you have not already, tap subscribe so you can join me on the next journey into Earth's deep mysteries. It may be the hidden signals of the Sahara, the final hours of the dinosaurs, or the secrets still locked in the stars above. Every story we explore here is a thread in the tapestry of our planet and our place within it. And if you feel moved to share, I would love to know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight, and do you believe Antarctica will one day thaw? Your reflections weave this little community together, stretching as wide as the world itself. So take a slow breath. Let the thought of ancient rainforests and frozen deserts drift through your mind as you close your eyes, and remember that even in its silence, Antarctica still speaks. Its story is never finished.